Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Clara pressed her face against the cool glass of the library window, watching the last traces of sunlight disappear behind the city's concrete skyline. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the empty reading tables, where she sat alone, surrounded by towers of history books that seemed to mock the sterile modernity around her. At 16, she felt like a relic herself, more comfortable with the dust-covered chronicles of ancient civilizations than with the digital world her classmates inhabited. The main floor had emptied hours ago, leaving only the night security guard and Clara, who had long ago earned the privilege of staying past closing time. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, trusted her completely. That girl lives and breathes history, she would tell the other staff members. She knows these books better than some of our cataloguers. Clara gathered her notebooks, filled with careful sketches of Egyptian hieroglyphs and Roman architecture, and made her way toward the basement archives. This was her true sanctuary, a labyrinth of forgotten shelves where old acquisitions sat waiting to be properly catalogued, where manuscripts donated decades ago still rested in their original boxes, untouched and unexamined. The basement smelled of aged paper and leather bindings, a perfume that made Clara feel more at home than anywhere else in the world. She had discovered this particular section 3 months ago, behind a heavy door marked Restricted Access that had been left unlocked. The room beyond contained dozens of glass display cases, most empty, but a few still holding treasures from the library's early collection. Clara had made it her personal mission to document everything she found, creating detailed inventories that she hoped to present to Mrs. Henderson someday as evidence of the basement's hidden value. Tonight, however, something was different. In the far corner of the room, illuminated by her flashlight, stood a case she had never noticed before. It was smaller than the others, made of dark wood rather than glass, and secured with an ornate brass lock that looked centuries old. Clara approached it slowly, her heart racing with the familiar thrill of discovery. The case sat atop a pedestal, and as she drew closer she could see something inside, a rolled parchment, yellowed with age, tied with what appeared to be a thin strip of leather. Attached to the leather binding was a wax seal, deep red and bearing the image of a phoenix with its wings spread wide. The mythical bird seemed to shimmer in the beam of her flashlight, as if the wax itself held some inner fire. Clara circled the case, looking for any identification or catalogue number, but found nothing. The wood was smooth and unadorned except for a small brass plate that bore only a single line of text in Latin. Tempus omnia revelat. Time reveals all things. She recognised the phrase from her studies, but seeing it here in this context sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the basement's cool temperature. The rational part of her mind insisted she should leave the case alone, return to the main floor and mention her discovery to Mrs. Henderson in the morning. But curiosity had always been Clara's greatest weakness and strongest asset. She pulled out her phone to take pictures, but the camera seemed unable to focus on the seal properly, producing only blurred images that failed to capture the phoenix's remarkable detail. Clara examined the lock more closely. It was clearly old, but time and humidity had corroded the metal enough that it seemed fragile. Almost without conscious decision, she found herself applying gentle pressure to the mechanism. To her surprise, the lock clicked open with barely any resistance, as if it had been waiting for her touch. The lid of the case lifted smoothly, releasing a scent that reminded Clara of desert sand and burning cedar. Inside, the scroll lay nestled in faded silk lining, looking impossibly ancient yet perfectly preserved. The leather binding was soft as velvet beneath her fingers as she carefully lifted the parchment from its resting place. She knew she should stop. Every instinct trained by years of handling fragile documents told her to put the scroll back immediately and seek proper supervision. But as she held it in her hands, she felt a strange warmth emanating from the parchment, as if the paper itself were alive. The phoenix seal seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, matching the beating of her heart. Clara untied the leather binding with trembling fingers. The wax seal cracked as she unrolled the scroll, fragments of red wax falling to scatter on the floor like drops of blood. As the parchment opened, she gasped at what she saw, not the medieval Latin or ancient Greek she had expected, but symbols that seemed to shift and dance before her eyes. Some appeared Egyptian, others resembled cuneiform, and still others looked like nothing she had ever encountered in her extensive studies. The symbols began to glow with a soft golden light that grew brighter as she stared at them. Clara blinked hard, certain she was imagining things, but the luminescence only intensified. The air around her began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement, and she felt a strange tugging sensation in her chest, as if something were trying to pull her forward into the parchment itself. "What is happening?" she whispered, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. The basement around her began to spin, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The shelves and boxes blurred into streaks of brown and grey, while the golden light from the scroll expanded to fill her entire field of vision. Clara tried to drop the parchment, but her fingers seemed frozen around its edges. The tugging in her chest became a rushing sensation, as if she were falling upward through an endless tunnel of light and time. She felt herself dissolving, her consciousness stretching across vast distances, and then darkness. Clara awoke to the sound of voices speaking in a language she recognised but had never heard spoken aloud, ancient Greek, but with an accent and cadence that her textbooks could never have conveyed. Her eyes fluttered open to reveal not the familiar concrete ceiling of the library basement, but soaring columns of white marble that stretched upward toward a ceiling painted with scenes of gods and heroes. She lay on a floor of polished stone, the scroll still clutched in her hands but no longer glowing. As consciousness fully returned, she realised she was surrounded by the most magnificent collection of written works she had ever imagined. Towering shelves carved from marble and cedar stretched in every direction, filled not with bound books but with thousands upon thousands of scrolls. Some shelves reached 30 feet high, accessible only by rolling ladders that scholars in white togas navigated with practised ease. Clara struggled to her feet, her modern jeans and hoodie feeling absurdly out of place among the flowing robes around her. The air smelled of papyrus and ink, cedarwood, and the salt breeze of a nearby sea. Somewhere in the distance she could hear the rhythm of waves against stone, and closer at hand the scratch of reed pens on parchment as dozens of scribes worked at long wooden tables. "The great library of Alexandria," she breathed, and the words seemed to echo in the vast space around her. But even as wonder threatened to overwhelm her, Clara noticed something wrong. The scholars weren't working with their usual careful deliberation. They moved with frantic urgency, gathering scrolls in their arms and rushing toward the exits. Voices raised in alarm echoed from distant corridors, and somewhere beyond the marble walls she could hear what sounded like shouting and the clash of metal on metal. A young man about her own age, wearing the simple tunic of a scribe's apprentice, rushed past her carrying an armload of papyri. He had dark hair and intelligent eyes that widened when he saw Clara's strange clothing. "You there!" he called in Greek. "What are you doing just standing there? Can't you hear them coming? The Romans will be here any moment." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he had said. Romans? Here? And then the historical reality crashed over her like a cold wave. If this was truly Alexandria in ancient times, and if Roman soldiers were approaching, then she knew exactly when she was. 48 BC, during Julius Caesar's siege of the city, when fire had consumed portions of the great library and countless irreplaceable works had been lost forever. "The fire," she whispered in Greek, surprised at how naturally the ancient language came to her lips. The young scribe nodded grimly. "The harbour warehouses are already burning, and they say Caesar's men are pushing into the palace quarter. Master Apollodorus has ordered us to save what we can, but—" He gestured helplessly at the countless thousands of scrolls surrounding them. "How do you save the knowledge of the world when you can only carry what fits in your arms?" As if summoned by his words, the acrid smell of smoke began to drift through the great hall. Clara looked around with new eyes, seeing not just the magnificent collection that represented humanity's greatest intellectual achievement, but also recognizing the tragic vulnerability of papyrus and wood in the face of fire. Everything she had studied, everything she had dreamed of seeing was about to be consumed by flames. The young scribe grabbed her arm. "I am Nico," he said. "You must be one of the new servant girls from the palace. Come, we need to get the most valuable texts to the harbour. There are ships waiting to carry them to safety. Clara wanted to correct him about her identity, but there seemed little point in explaining the impossible truth. Instead, she followed him as he led her through corridors she had only imagined from historical descriptions. They passed reading rooms where philosophers had debated the nature of existence, laboratories where mathematicians had calculated the circumference of the Earth, and halls where physicians had recorded their observations of the human body. "Here," Nico said, pressing several scrolls into her arms. "These are copies of Eratosthenes' geographical works, irreplaceable calculations, and this," he added a smaller scroll to her burden, "contains mathematical proofs that exist nowhere else in the world." Clara accepted the scrolls with reverent care, feeling the weight of centuries of human knowledge in her arms. But as they made their way toward what Nico indicated was the harbour exit, she noticed something extraordinary. The scroll she had opened in the library, the Phoenix Scroll, was glowing again, faintly but unmistakably, from where she had tucked it into her jacket pocket. They emerged onto a balcony overlooking Alexandria's great harbour, and Clara gasped at the scene below. The city she had studied in countless books was spread out before her in living detail. The lighthouse of Alexandria rising impossibly tall from Pharos Island, merchant ships from a dozen nations crowded along the waterfront, and the palace complex gleaming white in the afternoon sun. But over it all hung a pall of black smoke, and she could see flames licking at buildings near the harbour. "Look there," Nico pointed toward the palace quarter, where Roman standards were visible above the rooftops. "Caesar's men have taken the royal district. They say Cleopatra herself has fled, and her brother Ptolemy is either dead or captured." The sound of breaking glass came from somewhere below them in the library, followed by shouts in Latin. Clara felt her heart sink as she realised how little time they had left. Already, precious scrolls were being abandoned in the corridors as scholars fled with only what they could carry. "Nico," she said urgently, "the scroll I carry, the one with the phoenix seal, do you know anything about it?" He looked at her with surprise. "You have the Phoenix Scroll? I thought that was legend. Master Demetrius spoke of it sometimes. A text that was said to carry knowledge across time itself, created by the first keepers of the library as a safeguard against exactly this kind of catastrophe." His eyes widened as he saw the faint glow emanating from her pocket. "By the gods, it is real!" More crashes echoed from below, accompanied by the crackle of flames. The acrid smoke was growing thicker, and Clara could see that several sections of the library were already burning. Scholars ran past them in increasing panic, some weeping openly as they watched centuries of work disappear in minutes. Clara pulled out the Phoenix Scroll and unrolled it partially. The symbols were definitely glowing now, brighter than before, and as she watched, they seemed to rearrange themselves into new patterns. Some of the characters looked familiar. She could make out what appeared to be coordinates or mathematical formulas, while others remained completely alien to her understanding. "It's trying to tell us something," she said to Nico, who stared at the scroll with a mixture of awe and terror. "The legends say it only activates when the knowledge it protects is in mortal danger," he replied. "Master Demetrius believed it was created not just to preserve information, but to ensure that someone would survive to carry that knowledge to a time when it could be safe." A section of the ceiling above them groaned ominously, and chunks of marble began to fall. The fire had reached the upper levels of the library, and Clara realised with growing horror that they were about to witness, and potentially die in, one of history's greatest tragedies. "We need to get out of here," Nico said. But even as he spoke, the sound of heavy footsteps and barked Latin commands echoed from the corridor behind them. Roman soldiers had reached this level of the library. They ran toward a side passage that Nico indicated led to the scholars' quarters, but their path was blocked by a wall of flames that had already consumed several rooms. The heat was intense, and Clara had to shield her face with her arm as they backtracked toward the main hall. "This way," Nico called, leading her toward a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into the oldest part of the library. There are ancient tunnels that connect to the harbour. They were built when the library was first constructed. As they descended the stone steps, Clara could hear the voices of Roman soldiers growing louder above them. The narrow staircase was lit only by the glow from her scroll and the flickering light of flames that were beginning to penetrate even these lower levels. The air grew cooler but heavier with smoke, making each breath an effort. They emerged into a circular chamber that Clara recognised from her studies. the original archive room where the library's most precious and ancient texts had been stored. Even now, in the midst of catastrophe, she felt a thrill of recognition at seeing the stone shelves and reading alcoves that scholars had described in their writings. But the chamber was not empty. A group of older scholars huddled around a large stone table, desperately copying text from scrolls onto smaller pieces of papyrus that could be more easily hidden and transported. Their leader, a man with a white beard and ink-stained fingers, looked up as Clara and Nico entered. "Nico," he called in relief, "thank the gods you're safe, and you've brought help." He gestured toward Clara with gratitude. "We need every hand we can get. These scrolls contain the core mathematical principles that underlie all our astronomical calculations. If they're lost, it will set human understanding back by centuries." Clara approached the table and saw that they were copying works she recognized from her studies. Texts by Hipparchus on trigonometry, calculations of planetary orbits, and geometric proofs that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for over 1,000 years. The scholars worked with desperate efficiency, but she could see that they would never be able to copy more than a fraction of the material before the fire reached them. "Master Apollodorus," Nico said to the bearded scholar, "she carries the Phoenix Scroll." The old man looked up sharply, his eyes immediately focusing on the glow emanating from Clara's jacket. "Impossible," he breathed. "That artifact was lost generations ago." Clara pulled out the scroll and spread it on the table. The symbols were now blazing with golden light, so bright that they illuminated the entire chamber. As the scholars gathered around, Clara noticed that the characters were definitely rearranging themselves, forming patterns that seemed to respond to the presence of the other documents. "Look," she said, pointing to a section near the centre of the scroll. "These symbols, they're reflecting the mathematical formulas you're copying." Indeed, as Apollodorus held up a papyrus covered with geometric calculations, corresponding symbols appeared on the Phoenix Scroll, glowing even brighter than the rest. It was as if the ancient artifact was absorbing and storing the knowledge around it. "Remarkable," the old scholar whispered. "The legends were true. It is a repository, designed to preserve essential knowledge across time itself." The sound of splintering wood came from above them, followed by the roar of flames consuming entire shelves of scrolls. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that thousands of years of human achievement were disappearing forever. Works by Sophocles that would never be recovered, scientific treatises that had taken lifetimes to complete, historical records of civilizations that would become mysteries to future archaeologists, all of it turning to ash and smoke. "We have to save more," she said desperately, but even as she spoke she knew it was impossible. The fire was spreading too quickly and they were running out of time. Nico grabbed her arm. "Listen," he said urgently. Above the crackle of flames they could hear voices shouting in Latin, growing closer. The Roman soldiers had found the staircase and were making their way down to the archive chamber. "They'll kill us all," one of the younger scholars said in panic. "Caesar's men show no mercy to those who resist." Apollodorus looked at Clara with sudden understanding. "The scroll," he said. "It's not just preserving knowledge, it's preparing for transport. The patterns, the way the symbols respond to other texts, it's building a complete record that can be carried forward in time." Clara stared at the Phoenix Scroll, and as she did, she began to understand. The artifact wasn't just a repository of knowledge, it was a vehicle designed to transport both information and a guardian across time to an era when that knowledge would be safe. The legends hadn't described a simple storage device, but a temporal escape mechanism created by scholars who had foreseen exactly this kind of catastrophe. The footsteps on the stone stairs were very close now, accompanied by the harsh breathing of men wearing heavy armour. Clara made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. "I have to activate it," she said to the assembled scholars. "The scroll is meant to carry knowledge forward. That's why it appeared in my time, and that's why I was brought back here." "Your time?" Nico asked. But before Clara could explain, Roman soldiers burst into the chamber. There were 6 of them, led by a centurion whose scarred face spoke of many battles. They wore the distinctive armour of Caesar's legions, and their swords were already drawn. The lead soldier barked something in Latin about searching for valuable items, and his men began roughly examining the scrolls and tablets scattered around the chamber. "Stand away from the table," the centurion commanded in accented Greek. Apollodorus stepped forward bravely. "These are scholarly works," he said with dignity. "They have no military value. We are simply trying to preserve knowledge for future generations." The Roman laughed harshly. "Knowledge is power, old man, and Caesar's enemies deserve neither." He gestured to his men. "Burn it all." One of the soldiers approached the table with a flaming torch, and Clara saw centuries of mathematical and astronomical achievement about to disappear forever. Without thinking, she stepped between the soldier and the ancient texts. "Please," she said in Latin, surprising everyone, including herself. "These works contain no political information. They're purely scientific. Destroying them serves no military purpose." The centurion studied her with interest, taking in her strange clothing and confident bearing. "You speak Latin well for a servant girl," he said suspiciously. "Where did you learn the language of Rome?" Before Clara could answer, Nico stepped up beside her. "She's under my protection," he said firmly, "and these scrolls belong to scholars, not politicians. Surely Rome respects learning and knowledge." The soldier with the torch grew impatient and moved toward the table again, but as he did so, the phoenix scroll blazed with sudden brilliance. The golden light was so intense that everyone in the chamber had to shield their eyes, and the Roman soldiers stepped back in alarm. "Sorcery," one of them shouted, and Clara saw several of the men reaching for weapons. The scroll was now burning with light so bright it was almost impossible to look at directly, and Clara could feel the same tugging sensation in her chest that she had experienced in the library basement. The symbols on the parchment were moving rapidly now, forming new patterns and absorbing glowing traces from every scroll and tablet in the chamber. "It's time," Apollodorus said with sudden understanding. "The Phoenix Scroll has recorded what it can, and now it must carry that knowledge to safety." Clara felt the temporal pull growing stronger, but she looked around the chamber at the scholars who devoted their lives to preserving human knowledge. She couldn't just abandon them to the Roman soldiers and the approaching fire. "Come with me," she said desperately. "The scroll can transport all of us." But Apollodorus shook his head sadly. "The legends are clear," he said. "The Phoenix Scroll carries one guardian and the knowledge they protect. We are meant to remain here, to save what we can in the time we have left." The Roman centurion was shouting orders now, trying to organize his men to seize the blazing scroll, but the light was so intense that none of them could approach the table. Clara could feel her connection to her own time growing stronger, pulling at her with increasing force. Nico grabbed her hand. "Remember us," he said urgently. "Remember what was here, what was lost, and what was saved. That's why you were chosen, to be the witness, the keeper of memory." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to find a way to save them all, but the golden light was expanding now, filling the entire chamber and making it impossible to see anything clearly. She felt herself beginning to dissolve again, her consciousness stretching across time and space. As the light consumed her vision, she heard the crash of burning timbers from above and Nico's voice calling out over the chaos. "The knowledge lives. The phoenix rises." Then there was only rushing wind and golden fire and the sensation of falling through centuries. Clara awoke on the cold concrete floor of the library basement, surrounded by the familiar smell of dust and old books. The Phoenix Scroll lay beside her, no longer glowing, looking once again like nothing more than an ancient piece of parchment. The wooden case stood open and empty, and fragments of red wax were scattered across the floor. For a moment she wondered if the entire experience had been some kind of vivid dream brought on by exhaustion and too many late nights studying. But as she sat up and examined herself, she found evidence that proved otherwise. Her jeans were singed at the cuffs from the heat of the fire, and her hoodie smelled of smoke and cedar. Most importantly, tucked into her jacket pocket alongside the Phoenix Scroll, she discovered a small piece of papyrus covered with mathematical calculations in Nico's careful handwriting. Clara unfolded the papyrus with trembling hands. It contained geometric proofs that she recognized from her studies, but these weren't copies from textbooks. They were written in the original Greek, in ink that was still slightly damp, by a young scholar who had pressed the fragment into her hands as the great library of Alexandria burned around them. She looked at the Phoenix Scroll again and saw that while it no longer blazed with supernatural light, faint symbols were still visible on its surface, thousands of tiny characters that seemed to contain compressed information from countless lost texts. The scroll had indeed become a repository, a backup drive for human knowledge that had been created to survive the destruction of one of history's greatest libraries. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she realised the full weight of what she had witnessed. She had stood in the great library of Alexandria during its final hours, had seen scholars desperately trying to save fragments of human achievement, had watched irreplaceable works disappear forever in smoke and flame. She was quite possibly the only living person who could describe what the library had actually looked like, how it had smelled, what the voices of ancient scholars had sounded like as they worked. But she was also the keeper of something more precious than memories. The Phoenix Scroll and the papyrus fragment represented knowledge that had been deliberately saved, passed forward through time to ensure that some trace of humanity's greatest intellectual achievement would survive. She thought of Nico and Apollodorus and the other scholars who had sacrificed themselves to preserve even small pieces of their world's learning, and she understood that she had been chosen not just as a witness, but as a guardian. Clara carefully rolled up both the Phoenix Scroll and the papyrus fragment, handling them with the reverence they deserved. She looked around the basement archive with new eyes, seeing it not as a forgotten storage room but as a modern version of what she had just left, a repository of human knowledge, waiting for someone who cared enough to explore and preserve it. The overhead lights flickered, reminding her that she was still alone in the library well past closing time. She needed to get home, to process what had happened, to figure out how to honour the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. But first, she took one last look at the empty wooden case and the scattered fragments of the Phoenix seal. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Clara noticed something that made her heart race. The wax fragments on the floor were beginning to glow with the same faint golden light she'd seen in the scroll. As she watched, the pieces began to move toward each other, slowly reforming the Phoenix seal as if drawn by an invisible force. She knelt and carefully collected the reassembling fragments, feeling the same warm pulse she had experienced when she first opened the case. The Phoenix seal was reconstituting itself, preparing for another journey through time. The scroll's power was not exhausted. It was simply resting, waiting for the next moment when human knowledge would need a guardian to carry it across the centuries. Clara smiled through her tears as she understood the full scope of what had been entrusted to her. She was not just the keeper of ancient knowledge, but part of an eternal cycle of preservation and protection that stretched across time itself. Somewhere in the future, another curious scholar would find the Phoenix Scroll, would break the seal, and would take their own journey to whenever human learning was most threatened. But that was a responsibility for tomorrow. Tonight she had knowledge to study, memories to record, and a connection to the ancient world that would never be broken. As she climbed the stairs from the basement archive, Clara felt the weight of history on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. The great library of Alexandria had burned, but its most precious treasures had survived, carried forward by a teenage girl who loved books more than her own safety. And someday, when the knowledge was threatened again, the Phoenix Scroll would rise once more, seeking another guardian worthy of its trust. Clara walked out into the night air, clutching the ancient parchments against her chest, knowing that she was no longer just a student of history. She had become history it. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The morning sun painted everything golden through the kitchen windows, and Maya Sinclair should have been getting ready. Her parents bustled around the marble countertops, her father checking his watch for the third time, while her mother packed last-minute snacks into a leather travel bag. 12-year-old David bounced between them like a pinball, his excitement barely contained as he rattled off everything he wanted to do at their lake house in Colorado. "Maya, sweetheart, are you sure you don't want to come?" Her mother's voice carried that familiar note of gentle concern. "We could postpone the SAT prep course. It's just one weekend." Maya looked up from her cereal, studying the three faces that had been her whole world for 16 years. Her father's kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, always patient, always understanding. Her mother's graceful smile, the one that could make any problem seem smaller. David's grin, gap-toothed and infectious, already anticipating the adventures ahead. Something twisted in her stomach, a feeling she couldn't name. "No, Mom, the test is in 2 weeks. I really need to focus." She forced a smile. "Besides, you guys will have more fun without me being all stressed and cranky." Her father ruffled her hair as he passed behind her chair. "You're never cranky, kiddo, but we understand. Your future comes first." The pride in his voice made her chest tighten. David threw his arms around her neck from behind, still vibrating with energy. I'm going to catch the biggest fish ever and take a picture for you." Maya hugged his thin arms, breathing in his familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and grass stains. "I'll hold you to that, troublemaker." The house felt impossibly quiet after they left. Maya tried to settle into her study routine, spreading ESAT prep books across the dining room table, but concentration eluded her. Every few minutes she found herself glancing toward the window, as if she could will their car back into the driveway. The silence pressed against her eardrums until she turned on music, then turned it off again when it felt too cheerful for her inexplicable melancholy. By noon, she'd managed exactly 3 math problems. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Made it to the airport. Love you, sweetheart. David wants you to know the snacks are epic." Maya smiled despite herself, typing back, "Tell him to save some for the trip. Love you guys." She didn't know those would be the last words she'd ever say to them. The call came at 3:47 p.m. Maya remembered the exact time because she'd been staring at the clock, willing the day to pass faster so her family would be back tomorrow evening. The phone rang with her father's ringtone, some jazz melody he'd loved, and she answered without looking, expecting his voice. "Miss Sinclair?" The woman on the other end sounded professional, careful. "This is Sandra Martinez from the Federal Aviation Administration. I'm calling about your parents, James and Catherine Sinclair, and your brother David." Maya's blood turned to ice water. "Yes. I'm very sorry to inform you that there was an accident. The aircraft they were travelling in experienced mechanical failure and went down approximately 30 miles outside Denver. There were no survivors." The words hit Maya like physical blows. The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering on the hardwood floor. She could hear the woman's voice continuing, something about recovery efforts and next steps, but the sound faded into a roar of white noise that filled her head. No survivors. The next weeks passed in a haze of condolences, funeral arrangements, and legal procedures that Maya barely comprehended. Relatives she'd only seen at Christmas descended on the house, speaking in hushed tones and bringing casseroles she couldn't eat. Her Aunt Rebecca, her mother's sister, tried to convince Maya to come stay with her family in Portland, but Maya couldn't bear the thought of leaving the house that still smelled like her father's coffee and her mother's perfume. She attended the memorial service in a borrowed black dress, staring at 3 photographs on easels while strangers shared memories of her family. The crash site had been too damaged, too scattered. There were no bodies to bury. Just photos and flowers and words that felt meaningless against the enormity of what was gone. 2 weeks after the service, when the relatives had finally gone home and the house fell silent again, Maya found herself driving to the small memorial park that had been erected near the crash site. She'd avoided it until now, unable to face the physical reminder of where her world had ended. The memorial was simple. A granite stone with the names of the 3 victims, surrounded by flowers and small mementos left by people who'd cared. Maya knelt in the grass, running her fingers over the engraved letters of their names. David Marcus Sinclair, age 12. The numbers looked so small, so insufficient to encompass a whole life. They were everything to you. Maya startled, spinning around to find an elderly woman standing a few feet away. She was tiny and bent with age, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a dark coat despite the warm afternoon. Her eyes were the strangest thing about her, pale blue, almost colourless, but sharp with an intelligence that seemed to see straight through Maya. "I'm sorry," Maya whispered, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I didn't know anyone else was here." "We often come to these places seeking answers," the old woman said softly, moving closer. "Seeking ways to undo what cannot be undone." She reached into her coat and withdrew something that glinted in the sunlight. "Sometimes, child, the universe provides." Before Maya could react, the woman pressed something into her palm, a pendant on a thin chain, warm as if it had been sitting in sunlight for hours. The pendant was unlike anything Maya had ever seen. Crystalline, multifaceted, with what looked like tiny gears and clockwork suspended impossibly within its transparent depths. "What is this?" Maya stared at the object, mesmerised by the way the gears seemed to move on their own, ticking with a rhythm that wasn't quite in sync with her heartbeat. "A gift," the woman said simply, "from someone who understands the weight of loss. It can rewrite fate, child, but every gift comes with a price." Maya looked up to ask what she meant, but the woman was gone. Maya spun in a full circle, scanning the empty memorial park, but there was no sign of the strange visitor. Only the pendant remained, solid and warm in her palm, its internal clockwork ticking steadily. That night, Maya lay in bed turning the pendant over in her hands. Whenever she held it, strange images flashed behind her eyelids, clock faces spinning backward, her father's laugh echoing from empty rooms, David's voice calling her name from someplace very far away. She told herself it was grief playing tricks on her mind, but the pendant seemed to pulse with its own life, growing warmer whenever the visions came. For 3 weeks she carried it with her everywhere, unable to put it down yet afraid to examine it too closely. She'd catch herself staring at it during what should have been senior year classes, watching the tiny gears turn, wondering if the old woman had been real, or just another manifestation of her fractured mind. Then came the night she couldn't take the silence anymore. Maya sat in the middle of her parents' bedroom floor, still wearing her father's too large sweater, clutching the pendant so tightly its edges cut into her palm. The house creaked around her, settling into another empty night, and the weight of forever pressed down until she couldn't breathe. "Please," she whispered to the pendant, to the universe, to anyone who might be listening. "Please let me see them again, just once more." The pendant grew scorching hot in her hand, and suddenly the world lurched sideways. Maya's vision blurred, filled with spinning clock faces and rushing wind, and then sunlight, the smell of coffee, her mother's voice drifting from the kitchen. Maya gasped, finding herself standing in the hallway outside her bedroom, wearing the same pyjamas she'd had on that morning 6 weeks ago, the morning of the accident. Her hands shook as she crept toward the kitchen, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe. They were there, all of them, exactly as she remembered. Her father reading the news on his tablet, her mother humming as she packed snacks, David practically vibrating with excitement about their trip. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched them, these beloved ghosts made flesh again. "Maya, sweetheart, are you sure you don't want to come?" This time, Maya almost said yes. The words sat on the tip of her tongue, heavy with longing. But if she went with them, if she changed that detail, would the pendant still work? Would it change everything else too? Instead, she said, "Actually, I think I'm getting sick. Maybe you guys should postpone." "Nonsense," her father said gently. "You've been looking forward to this trip for weeks, and David will be heartbroken if we cancel." He caught her eye and smiled. "We'll bring you back something special, okay?" Maya's throat closed up. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched them finish their preparations. David hugged her extra tight before they left, as if some part of him sensed this goodbye was different. "Love you, Maya." "Love you too, troublemaker." The moment their car disappeared around the corner, Maya was moving. She ran to the garage, grabbed her father's toolbox and drove to the small private airport where they kept their plane. Her hands shook as she worked, loosening bolts in the engine compartment, disconnecting wires she prayed were crucial. She had no idea if she was doing enough or if she was damaging the right systems, but desperation guided her movements. When the maintenance alert triggered and their departure was delayed indefinitely, Maya felt a triumph so fierce it nearly brought her to her knees. Her phone buzzed. Her father. "Looks like we're grounded today, kiddo. Mechanical issues. We'll try again tomorrow." Maya almost sobbed with relief. She'd done it. She'd saved them. That afternoon she sat with her family on the couch, David curled against her side while they watched a movie. Her parents held hands in the armchair like teenagers, and Maya memorized every detail, the way her mother unconsciously played with her wedding ring, how her father's eyes crinkled when he laughed at David's commentary, the weight of her brother's head on her shoulder. It was perfect. It was everything she'd dreamed about during those long, empty weeks. Then the emergency broadcast interrupted their movie. "This is a breaking news alert. A commercial airliner en route from Denver to Phoenix has crashed shortly after takeoff. Flight 447 was carrying 312 passengers and crew. There are no reported survivors at this time. We'll continue following this story as more information becomes available." The room went silent except for the newscaster's voice. Maya felt ice water flooding her veins as the implications hit her. 312 people. Her father reached for the remote, his face grave. "Those poor families," he murmured. Maya's mother pulled David closer, pressing her face into his hair. "I can't imagine losing a child," she whispered. But Maya could imagine it now. She was imagining 312 families receiving phone calls like the one she'd gotten 6 weeks ago, 312 families planning funerals, struggling with the impossible weight of sudden loss. Had she caused this? Had her sabotage somehow triggered a chain of events that brought down a commercial flight? The pendant lay heavy against her chest, and she wondered if its clockwork gears were laughing at her naive assumption that saving 3 lives could come without a cost. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling while her family slept peacefully down the hall. She could hear David talking in his sleep, her father's soft snoring, her mother getting up for her usual midnight glass of water. All the sounds she'd missed so desperately, now tainted by the knowledge of what her joy had cost. The next morning brought more coverage of the crash. Maya couldn't stop watching, torturing herself with every detail. The flight manifest scrolled across the screen, names, ages, brief descriptions of lives cut short. Maria Santos, 34, mother of 2, Thomas Chen, 7, travelling alone to visit his grandmother, Jennifer Morrison, 23, newlywed returning from her honeymoon. And then Maya saw her, a little girl, maybe 8 years old, sobbing into a microphone at a press conference. Her name was Emma Walsh, and she'd lost her parents and older sister in the crash. She'd stayed behind because of a stomach bug, just like Maya had stayed behind for SAT prep. "I want my mummy," the little girl cried, and Maya watched herself, her own grief, her own devastation, reflected in those tears. Maya ran to the bathroom and vomited until her stomach was empty. The pendant burned against her skin, its gears ticking faster, as if counting down to some inevitable conclusion. Maya stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing a stranger wearing her face. Who was she to decide that her family's lives were worth more than 312 others? What gave her the right to trade their grief for hers? But when David bounded into the kitchen that morning, chattering about plans for their rescheduled trip, Maya almost convinced herself she could live with the guilt. Almost. "Maya, you look terrible," her mother said, pressing a cool hand to her forehead. "Are you sure you're not getting sick?" Maya leaned into the touch she'd thought she'd never feel again, closing her eyes. "I'm okay, Mum." But she wasn't okay. Every news report was a knife in her chest. Every mention of the families destroyed in the crash made her question the choice she'd thought was so clear-cut. The pendant grew heavier each day, as if it were absorbing the weight of her guilt. A week later, Maya found herself back at the memorial park where the old woman had given her the pendant. She knelt by the granite stone, running her fingers over her family's names, and wondered if she was losing her mind. Having second thoughts, Maya didn't even startle this time. The old woman stood behind her again, looking exactly as she had before, ageless, knowing, sad in a way that went deeper than any single loss. "You knew," Maya said, without turning around. "You knew what would happen." "I knew what always happens," the woman replied. "The universe demands balance. You cannot create joy without creating sorrow elsewhere." 312 people, Maya whispered. "Yes. Why didn't you warn me? Would you have listened? When you were drowning in grief, would warnings from a stranger have stopped you from trying to save the people you loved most?" Maya finally turned to face her. "What are you?" Someone who was given the same choice long ago. Someone who learned that the hardest decisions are often the most necessary ones. The old woman knelt beside Maya, her colourless eyes reflecting the afternoon sky. "The pendant doesn't create tragedy, child. It simply moves it. There are paths where your family lives and others die. Paths where those 312 people live and your family dies. The only question is, who decides which path we follow?" "I can't make that choice," Maya said, tears streaming down her face. "I can't choose who lives and who dies." "Then perhaps you've learned what the pendant was meant to teach you." Maya stared at the crystal in her palm, watching its gears turn with mechanical precision. Each tick seemed to echo with the heartbeats of the people she could save or doom with her choice. That night, she sat in her father's study, surrounded by the smell of his cologne and the books he'd never finish reading. David's laughter echoed from the living room where he was playing video games with their parents, and Maya felt her heart break all over again. She thought about Emma Walsh, crying on television. She thought about Maria Santos's 2 children, about Thomas Chen's grandmother waiting at the airport. She thought about Jennifer Morrison's new husband, planning a life they'd never have. Then she thought about her own family, warm and alive and real, just down the hall. Her father would help her with college applications next month. Her mother would teach her to make the family stuffing recipe at Thanksgiving. David would lose his first tooth and leave it under his pillow for the tooth fairy. All of it would happen if she just let it happen. All she had to do was nothing. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emma Walsh's tears. Maya clutched the pendant until its edges drew blood from her palm. "Please," she whispered to the clockwork heart of it. "One more time." The world spun away from her again, pulling her back through time like a fish on a hook, and suddenly she was standing in her hallway on the morning that had started it all. The morning when everything went wrong. Or right, depending on how you looked at it. Her family moved through their breakfast routine below, unaware that their daughter had lived through this morning twice before, unaware of the weight of decision that pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Maya walked downstairs on unsteady legs. Her father looked up from his tablet and smiled, the expression so familiar and dear that Maya had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. "Morning, sweetheart. Ready for your SAT prep?" Maya opened her mouth to tell him about the mechanical issues, to warn him about what would happen if they took off today. The words sat on her tongue like stones. Instead, she said, "I love you, Dad." He blinked in surprise, then his expression softened. "I love you too, kiddo." She hugged each of them goodbye, memorizing the feel of their arms around her, the sound of their voices, the way David's hair stuck up in the back no matter how much their mother tried to smooth it down. "Be safe," she whispered into her mother's ear. "Always are," her mother replied, kissing her cheek. Maya watched their car disappear around the corner and felt her heart shatter all over again. But this time, she didn't run to the airport. This time, she sat on the front porch steps and waited for a call she now knew was coming. The pendant lay warm against her chest, its gears slowing as the timeline settled back into its original path. Maya could feel the commercial flight taking off safely from Denver, carrying 312 people home to their families. She could feel Emma Walsh's parents and sister settling into their seats, unaware of how close they'd come to disaster. At 3:47 p.m, Maya's phone rang. She answered on the first ring this time, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I know," she told Sandra Martinez before the woman could speak. "I already know." After the call ended, Maya walked into the backyard and pulled the pendant from around her neck. It felt lighter now, its gears barely moving, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. She studied its crystal faces one last time, seeing her reflection fractured into a dozen broken pieces. "Thank you," she whispered to it, though she wasn't sure if she was grateful or not. She drove to the coast that evening, to the cliffs overlooking the Pacific where her family used to go for picnics. The sun was setting, painting the water gold and orange, and Maya stood at the edge thinking about choices and consequences, about love and sacrifice. The pendant felt warm in her palm one last time as she drew back her arm and hurled it as far as she could into the churning waves below. She watched it disappear beneath the surface, carrying its terrible gift down into the dark. Maya lived the rest of her life carrying the weight of what she'd done, not just losing her family, but choosing to lose them. There were days when the grief felt like drowning, when she questioned whether she'd made the right choice at all. She thought about Emma Walsh often, wondering if that little girl grew up whole and happy, if the parents Maya had saved told their daughter they loved her every single day. She graduated high school with honours, using her father's life insurance money to attend the college he'd wanted her to go to. She studied psychology, drawn to understanding trauma and loss, and eventually became a counsellor specialising in helping children cope with sudden family deaths. Every client reminded her of Emma Walsh. Every success felt like a small redemption. Sometimes, late at night in her apartment that was too quiet and too empty, Maya would trace the chain marks the pendant had left on her throat and wonder if there was another timeline where she'd kept her family and learned to live with the guilt. She wondered if that version of herself was happy, if the weight of 312 deaths had eventually faded, if David had grown up to be the doctor he'd always dreamed of becoming. But those thoughts never lasted long, because Maya had learned something that the pendant had tried to teach her from the beginning. Love isn't about holding on. Sometimes love means letting go, even when letting go destroys you. On the anniversary of the crash, Maya would drive back to the memorial park and lay flowers on the granite stone that bore her family's names. She would kneel in the grass and tell them about her life, about the people she had helped, about the choice she'd made for them and for strangers whose names she'd never know. "I hope you understand," she would whisper to the stone, to the wind, to the empty sky. "I hope you know that I loved you enough to let you go." And sometimes, when the wind blew just right through the memorial park, Maya could swear she heard David's laugh carried on the air, her mother's gentle voice, her father's proud approval. She could swear they were telling her that love, in the end, was exactly that. The courage to choose others' joy over your own, even when the cost was everything that mattered. Maya carried that knowledge with her for the rest of her days, a weight both terrible and precious, a reminder that the hardest choices were often the most necessary ones. She never married, never had children, never built the kind of family life that might have healed the hollow space where her heart used to be. But she slept peacefully at night, knowing that somewhere in the world Emma Walsh was grown and whole, that 312 families had been spared the devastation Maya knew so intimately. She slept knowing that love sometimes meant sacrifice, and that sacrifice, however painful, could be its own kind of gift. The pendant was gone, swallowed by the sea, its power spent. But its lesson lived on in the woman who had learned that the greatest magic wasn't changing the past, it was finding the strength to accept it, and to choose hope over despair, love over loss, and the greater good over your own heart's desire. In the end, that was more than enough. Years passed like pages turning in a book Maya could never quite finish reading. She became Doctor Maya Sinclair, though the title always felt borrowed, as if it belonged to someone else, someone whose family had lived to see her graduate, to cry her doctoral defence, to frame her diploma on their refrigerator next to David's crayon drawings that would never exist. Her practice grew slowly but steadily. Word spread through the network of grief counsellors and child psychologists about the young woman who understood loss in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. Parents brought their shattered children to her small office, overlooking a garden she tended with the same meticulous care her mother had once shown their rose bushes. Maya specialised in what the literature called complicated grief, the kind that didn't follow neat stages or timelines, the kind that came from sudden, senseless loss. She worked with children who'd lost parents in car accidents, teens whose siblings had died in school shootings, families torn apart by natural disasters that struck without warning. Each case was a mirror reflecting her own fractured heart, and each small victory felt like a prayer answered. There was Tommy, age 7, who stopped speaking after his mother died in a hospital fire. Maya sat with him week after week, saying nothing herself, until one day he whispered, "Do you think she's scared?" Maya had held his small hand and told him the truth, that she didn't know what came after, but she knew his mother had been brave, and brave people didn't stay scared for long. Tommy started talking again that day. There was Angie, 16 and furious, whose entire family had been killed by a drunk driver while she was at a sleepover. Angie raged through their first dozen sessions, throwing books and screaming that Maya couldn't possibly understand. "You still have your family," she'd spit through tears. Maya had waited for the storm to pass, then quietly told Angie about a plane crash and 3 empty chairs at a dinner table. They'd cried together that day, and slowly, session by session, Angie had learned to carry her anger like a tool instead of a weapon. But it was Emma Walsh who changed everything. Maya first saw her name on a referral form when Emma was 14, 8 years after the crash that had claimed her family. She'd been through a string of therapists, each one unable to break through the wall of guilt and survivor's remorse that had calcified around Emma's heart. She was cutting herself, her social worker explained, failing classes despite obvious intelligence, pushing away anyone who tried to get close. When Emma walked into Maya's office for the first time, Maya felt the pendant's phantom weight against her chest like a ghost made of gold and crystal. Emma had her mother's eyes, Maya knew because she'd memorised every photograph from the memorial coverage, and the same stubborn set to her jaw that David had inherited from their father. "Another shrink," Emma muttered, slumping into the chair across from Maya's desk. "Let me guess. You want to talk about my feelings." Maya studied the girl who existed because of her choice, this living proof that sometimes sacrifice bore fruit in forms you never expected. Emma was tall for her age, all sharp angles and defensive posture, her dark hair hanging like a curtain between her and the world. "Actually," Maya said, "I was wondering if you knew anything about gardening." Emma blinked, thrown off her script. "What?" "Gardening. Growing things. Maya gestured toward the window where her small garden bloomed with careful precision. My mother used to say that some plants only grow strong after they've been broken. Cut a rose stem at the right angle, and it sends out new shoots. Burn a forest, and certain seeds only sprout in the ash. That's stupid, Emma said, but Maya caught the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Maybe, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately, about whether broken things can grow into something beautiful, or if they're just forever broken. They talked about gardens and broken things for 3 months before Emma finally mentioned the crash. She'd been having the dream again, the one where she was on the plane with her family, where she felt the moment of impact, where she woke up wishing she'd been there to die with them instead of home with a stomach bug. The guilt is the worst part, Emma whispered during their 20th session, finally letting the curtain of hair fall away from her face. Everyone says I should be grateful to be alive, but I just feel like I stole something, like I took their spot in the world, and now I don't know how to fill it. Maya's throat tightened. What if I told you that your being alive saved other people from feeling exactly what you're feeling right now? I'd say you're talking crazy. Maybe I am. Maya leaned forward, weighing her words carefully. But sometimes I think about all the ripple effects we never see. Your family died on that flight, Emma. But what if there was another plane that was supposed to crash that day, with hundreds of people on it? What if somehow, in some cosmic accounting system we can't understand, your family's death prevented that bigger tragedy? Emma stared at her with those eyes that were her mother's eyes, that were alive because Maya had chosen to let her own mother die. You really believe that? I believe that love finds ways to protect people, even from beyond death. I believe your parents would rather have died themselves than let hundreds of other families go through what you've been going through. Emma was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at Maya's garden where roses bloomed from stems that had been cut and grafted and tended with patient hands. My mum used to garden, she said finally. She said plants were like people. Sometimes they needed to be broken a little to grow stronger. Maya felt tears threaten behind her eyes. Your mum sounds like she was very wise. Their work together took 2 years. Maya watched Emma slowly unfurl like a flower reaching towards sunlight, watched her learn to carry her grief like a sacred burden rather than a poisonous weight. Emma started volunteering at a children's hospital, reading to kids who were scared and alone. She got her grades back up, made friends, even started dating a boy who made her laugh until her sides hurt. On the day before Emma's 18th birthday, she brought Maya a small potted rose bush. It's a memorial rose, Emma explained, setting it carefully on Maya's desk. They breed them to bloom twice, once in memory of what's lost and once in hope of what's coming. She looked up at Maya with eyes that were clear now, free of the shadows that had haunted them for so long. I wanted you to have it because you taught me that broken doesn't mean dead, that sometimes being broken is just the first step toward becoming something new. Maya had to excuse herself to cry in the bathroom, overcome by the weight of grace. This girl, alive and healing and whole, living proof that Maya's choice had been worth the cost. But Emma wasn't finished. As she was leaving that day, she paused at the door and looked back. Doctor, Sinclair, I know you lost people too. I can see it in how you understand things that other people don't. I just wanted you to know, whoever you lost, whatever happened, they'd be proud of who you became. They'd be proud of how you've helped people like me. After Emma left, Maya sat alone in her office holding the memorial rose, its thorns pressing into her palms like the phantom ache of a pendant that no longer existed. She thought about David, who would have been 24 now, probably finishing medical school with that same stubborn determination that had driven him to memorize every dinosaur name by age 5. She thought about her mother, who would have loved seeing Maya help broken things grow strong again. She thought about her father, who would have understood why she'd made the choice she'd made, who would have told her that love wasn't about keeping people safe, it was about helping them become who they were meant to be. The memorial rose bloomed twice that year, just as Emma had promised. Once in late spring, deep red petals that reminded Maya of her mother's garden, and once in early fall, pale pink blooms that caught the light like David's gap-toothed grin. Maya tended it carefully, this living symbol of love that grew from loss, of choices that echoed across time in ways their makers could never fully understand. She watered it with careful hands and spoke to it sometimes when the office was empty, telling it about the children she'd helped, the families she'd counselled through their darkest hours. the small ways she'd learned to honour her family's memory by living a life worthy of their sacrifice. In the end, perhaps that was what the pendant had really been about. Not changing the past, but learning to grow something beautiful from its ashes. Not rewriting fate, but accepting it with enough grace to transform pain into purpose, loss into love, endings into new beginnings that honoured what came before while reaching toward what might still be possible. The rose bloomed and bloomed, season after season, a reminder that some things, love, memory, the echo of choices made with a breaking heart, were stronger than time itself. Maya was 43 when she first saw the old woman again. She was leaving her office on a Thursday evening, the memorial rose carefully potted and ready to move to her new practice, a larger space where she could help more children, train other therapists in trauma counselling. The sun was setting behind the building, casting long shadows across the parking lot, when Maya noticed a familiar figure standing by her car. The woman looked exactly the same as she had 27 years ago at the crash memorial. The same silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, the same dark coat, the same colourless eyes that seemed to see through time itself. She was holding something in her weathered hands, another pendant, its crystalline surface catching the dying light. "Hello, Maya," the old woman said softly. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. "You're not real. You can't be real. I'm as real as the choice you made all those years ago, as real as the lives you've saved since then." The woman stepped closer, and Maya could see the tiny clockwork gears turning within the new pendant, just as they had the first one. "You've done well with the gift I gave you." "Gift?" Maya's voice cracked. "You call losing my family a gift?" "I call learning to love without possessing a gift, learning to sacrifice without bitterness, learning to heal others because you understand their pain." The woman held up the pendant, its gears catching starlight that seemed to come from nowhere. "Few people pass the test, Maya. Most use the pendant to save themselves, over and over, creating endless loops of tragedy as they try to avoid their own suffering." Maya stared at the pendant, feeling its pull like gravity. There were others, many others. A mother who lost her son in a car accident. She used the pendant 17 times, saving him again and again, each time causing a different tragedy somewhere else. She never learned, never accepted. The pendant became a prison of her own making. The woman's expression grew sad. A man who lost his wife to cancer used it to prevent her death, only to watch her die in different ways. A heart attack, a stroke, an accident. He tried for decades to find a timeline where she lived, never understanding that some things cannot be changed, only accepted. What happened to them? Eventually, the pendant consumed them. They became trapped between timelines, neither fully alive nor properly dead, forever chasing a past they couldn't let go of. The woman's eyes met Maya's. "You were different. You learned what the pendant was truly meant to teach." Maya felt cold despite the warm evening air. Which was? That love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go. The woman extended the new pendant toward Maya. "This is for someone else. Someone who needs to learn what you learned." Maya stepped back. "Number, I won't do it. I won't be responsible for someone else's suffering." "You won't be responsible for their suffering, Maya. You'll be responsible for their healing. The pendant doesn't create tragedy. It reveals the tragedy that already exists, forces people to confront the weight of their choices." The woman smiled, and for the first time her expression held warmth. "You think I appeared to you by accident? You think I chose you randomly? Didn't you? I chose you because I saw what you would become. I saw the woman who would sacrifice everything for strangers, who would build a life dedicated to healing the wounds she understood so intimately." The woman's voice grew gentle. "I chose you because I knew you would choose love over selfishness, even when love demanded the ultimate price." Maya felt tears burning her eyes. "My family? Your family lives on in every child you've helped, every parent you've counselled through their darkest hour." David's laughter echoes in Tommy's voice when he finally speaks again. "Your mother's compassion flows through your hands when you hold Emma while she cries. Your father's wisdom guides your words when you help families find meaning in their loss." The woman pressed the pendant into Maya's reluctant palm. "They are not gone, Maya. They have simply been transformed into something larger than themselves." The pendant felt different from the first one, warmer, somehow less threatening. Its gears moved slowly, peacefully, like a heartbeat at rest. "Who is it for?" Maya whispered. "You'll know when the time comes." Someone will find their way to you, carrying a grief so profound it threatens to destroy not just them, but everyone they touch. Someone who needs to learn what you learned, that the deepest love sometimes requires the greatest sacrifice. Maya looked up to ask more questions, but the woman was already fading, becoming translucent in the gathering dusk. "Wait," Maya called out. "What's your name?" "Who are you really?" The woman's voice came from very far away, carried on wind that smelled of roses and regret. "I was the first, Maya, the first to face the choice you faced. I learned, as you learned, that some gifts are too precious to keep for ourselves." And then she was gone, leaving only the pendant and the echo of her words hanging in the evening air. Maya drove home in a daze, the pendant heavy in her jacket pocket. She set it on her kitchen table and stared at it while she made dinner she couldn't eat, watched it while she tried to focus on case files that blurred before her eyes. That night, she dreamed of clock faces spinning backward, of David's laughter and her mother's garden, of a little girl crying on television who had grown into a woman who saved other broken children. 3 weeks later, Dr. Sarah Chen walked into Maya's office. Sarah was 35, a successful surgeon whose husband and twin daughters had been killed in a home invasion while she was working a night shift at the hospital. She'd tried to return to work too soon, made a mistake during surgery that cost another patient their life, and was now facing both malpractice suits and a complete psychological breakdown. "I should have been home," Sarah said during their first session, her voice flat with shock. "If I'd been home, I could have protected them, or at least died with them." Maya recognised the tone, the hollow grief that echoed with might-have-beens and if-alonelys. She recognised the particular agony of survivors' guilt mixed with professional failure, the crushing weight of being unable to save the people who mattered most, while failing to save strangers too. Sarah had been seeing other therapists for months, but nothing helped. She'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped engaging with life in any meaningful way. Her colleagues were worried she might hurt herself. Her sister was threatening to have her committed. "I keep thinking," Sarah continued, staring at her hands, "about all the people I've saved on operating tables, hundreds of them, and I couldn't save my own family. What's the point of any of it?" Maya felt the pendant's weight in her desk drawer like a second heartbeat. Not yet, she told herself. Sarah needed traditional therapy first, needed to process her trauma through conventional means. But Maya could see the depth of her despair, the way it was calcifying into something harder and more dangerous with each passing day. They worked together for 6 months. Maya used every technique in her arsenal, every hard-won insight from her own journey through grief. Sarah made small improvements. She started eating again, returned to work part-time, managed to sleep for a few hours each night without nightmares. But Maya could see that it wasn't enough. Sarah was going through the motions of healing without truly engaging with life. She'd built walls around her heart so high and thick that no joy could penetrate, no love could take root. She was existing rather than living, surviving rather than thriving. Then came the night Sarah called Maya at 2 a.m., her voice slurred with sleeping pills and wine. "I found them," Sarah whispered into the phone. "The men who killed my family. They're in prison, but they're up for parole in 5 years. 5 years, Dr. Sinclair, and my girls will still be dead." Maya was already getting dressed, already calculating how long it would take to reach Sarah's apartment. "Sarah, I need you to stay on the phone with me. Are you somewhere safe?" "Safe?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "I haven't been safe since the night they died. None of us are safe. That's the joke, isn't it? We pretend we can protect the people we love, but we can't. We're all just waiting for the universe to take them away." Maya was in her car now, driving through empty streets while talking Sarah through breathing exercises, keeping her voice calm while her heart raced. She found Sarah on the floor of her bathroom, surrounded by pill bottles and family photos, conscious but barely coherent. The hospital pumped Sarah's stomach and kept her on psychiatric hold for 72 hours. When she was released, she looked at Maya with eyes that held no hope at all. "I can't do this anymore," she said simply. "I can't keep pretending that life has meaning without them." That night, Maya sat in her office after hours, holding the pendant up to the lamplight and watching its gears turn with mechanical precision. She thought about the old woman's words, about love and sacrifice and the weight of choices that echoed across time. She thought about Sarah, brilliant and broken, carrying a grief that was slowly poisoning everything around her. She thought about all the patients Sarah could still save, all the lives she could still touch, If only she could learn to transform her pain into purpose instead of letting it consume her. Maya had never told anyone about the pendant, had never spoken of her family or the choice she'd made, but as she looked at the crystal surface and saw her own reflection fractured into a dozen pieces, she realised that some gifts were meant to be passed on, some lessons could only be learned through experience. The next morning she would offer Sarah a different kind of healing, not the slow, traditional path of talk therapy and medication, but the sharp, transformative lesson of understanding that love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice, and that such sacrifices could become the foundation for a life of meaning and service. Maya closed her eyes and felt her family's presence like sunlight on her face, their love flowing through her into all the lives she'd touched, all the healing she'd facilitated, all the hope she'd helped kindle in hearts that had thought themselves permanently broken. The pendant grew warm in her palm, its gears spinning faster, as if sensing that its purpose was about to be fulfilled once again. The next story is about to begin, please relax and enjoy. Clara Wells had always been drawn to the impossible. As a graduate researcher in molecular biology at Stanford's Institute for Advanced Temporal Studies, she spent her days analysing theoretical frameworks that most scientists dismissed as science fiction. The laboratory hummed with the quiet intensity of discovery, rows of equipment casting shadows across sterile white surfaces, while her colleagues pursued more conventional research paths. Clara, however, had devoted the last 3 years of her life to understanding the temporal displacement device that Dr. Marcus Venn had abandoned after his funding dried up. The machine itself was an unassuming collection of chrome cylinders and quantum processors, roughly the size of a telephone booth, tucked away in the basement level of the research facility. Most days, Clara worked alone, adjusting calibrations and running theoretical simulations on energy displacement patterns. Her advisor had warned her that temporal mechanics was a career dead end, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that time travel held answers to questions humanity hadn't yet learned to ask. She believed that understanding the flow of time might unlock solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable in linear thinking. On the morning that would change everything, Clara arrived at the lab early, her coffee still steaming as she reviewed her latest calculations. The temporal device had been showing promising energy readings for weeks, suggesting that the quantum field generators were finally achieving the resonance frequencies Dr. Venn had theorized. Clara had spent countless hours fine-tuning the calibration sequences, and today's test represented the culmination of her work. She intended to send a small biological sample forward in time by exactly 24 hours, a modest goal that would prove the device's functionality without risking significant temporal disruption. The morning light filtered through the basement windows as Clara prepared her test materials. She selected a petri dish containing a culture of common bacteria, sealed it within the device's central chamber, and began the startup sequence. The machine responded beautifully, its quantum processors humming with increasing intensity as energy coursed through the temporal field generators. Clara monitored the readouts carefully, watching as the chronometer displays indicated successful temporal field formation. Everything proceeded exactly as her calculations had predicted, but as Clara reached for the activation switch, her sleeve caught on a secondary control panel, accidentally engaging the human-scale temporal field instead of the microscopic setting she had intended. The device's safety protocols, designed to prevent accidental activation, had been disabled during her calibration work. In the split second before Clara could react, the entire chamber filled with brilliant white light, and the sensation of falling consumed her consciousness. Clara's next coherent memory was of silence, not the ordinary quiet of a laboratory or library, but an absolute absence of sound that seemed to press against her eardrums with physical weight. She found herself lying on cracked earth, beneath a sky the colour of old bone, stretching endlessly in all directions without a single cloud or bird to break its monotony. The air tasted of dust and metal, carrying no hint of vegetation or life. As Clara struggled to her feet, she realised that the temporal device was nowhere to be seen, leaving her stranded in whatever time and place she had arrived. The landscape around her defied comprehension. Where she expected to see trees, grass, or even weeds, Clara found only barren soil and scattered debris that might once have been buildings. The horizon revealed no signs of movement, no indication that anything lived in this desolate world. Most disturbing was the absence of insects. No flies, no ants, no beetles scurrying across the ground. Clara, whose career had been built on understanding biological systems, felt a deep unease at finding herself in a world apparently devoid of animal life. As she walked across the wasteland, Clara discovered the first signs of human habitation, a series of metal hatches built into the ground, their surfaces worn smooth by time and weather. One of the hatches stood partially open, revealing a ladder that descended into artificial light. Clara's scientific training warred with her survival instincts, but curiosity ultimately won. She climbed down into the underground passage, following the sound of distant voices through corridors lined with LED strips and ventilation systems. The underground city that Clara discovered challenged every assumption she had held about human civilization. Miles of tunnels connected vast chambers where thousands of people lived in structures that resembled nothing so much as an enormous ant colony. The air was clean but artificial, filtered and recycled through systems that hummed constantly in the background. Citizens moved through the corridors with purposeful efficiency, their clothing functional and uniform, their expressions displaying a resignation that Clara found deeply troubling. Clara's arrival created an immediate stir among the underground dwellers. Her clothing, her hair, even her skin tone marked her as different from the pale inhabitants who had spent their lives away from natural sunlight. Within hours, Clara found herself brought before the Settlement Council, a governing body of men and women whose ages were difficult to determine, but whose eyes held the weight of inherited tragedy. Council Chairman Marcus Chen, a man whose gentle demeanour couldn't disguise the authority in his voice, explained their history with the patience of someone who had told this story many times before. The Great Dying began in the year 2089, he said, consulting records displayed on a holographic interface. At first, it seemed like an ordinary livestock disease, cattle falling sick in agricultural regions, birds dropping from the sky in isolated instants. The early reports described it as a respiratory infection, highly contagious among animals but harmless to humans. Chen's narrative unfolded like a horror story told in the calm voice of a documentary narrator. The disease had spread with terrifying efficiency, jumping between species with an adaptability that defied all biological precedent. Mammals died first, followed by birds, then reptiles and amphibians. Even insects succumbed within months, leaving ecosystems in complete collapse. The governments assured everyone that containment was possible, Chen continued. They established quarantine zones, implemented mass culling programs, funded research into vaccines and treatments. But the pathogen adapted faster than our science could understand it. Clara listened with growing horror as Chen described the social upheaval that followed. Food systems collapsed as agricultural animals died and pollinating insects vanished. Governments fell as desperate populations demanded solutions that didn't exist. Wars broke out over remaining resources while the disease continued its relentless spread. Within 50 years, every animal species on Earth had been eliminated, leaving humanity alone on a planet that could no longer sustain life on its surface. The underground colonies were humanity's last hope, Chen explained. We developed synthetic food production, artificial atmosphere systems, renewable energy networks powered by geothermal sources. We preserved human culture and knowledge, maintained libraries and schools, raised children who would never see the sky except through observation domes. We survived, but we lost everything that made Earth beautiful. Clara's scientific mind reeled at the implications of Chen's story. The timeline he described placed the origin of the Great Dying in what was, from Clara's perspective, the very near future. More troubling still, Chen's description of the initial pathogen matched research Clara had encountered in her own time, a genetically modified livestock vaccine that had shown unusual mutation patterns in laboratory testing. She remembered reading about the project in scientific journals, recalled conversations with colleagues who had dismissed the mutation risk as negligible. As Clara explored the underground settlement over the following days, she began to understand the full scope of humanity's loss. Children grew up learning about animals through historical recordings and artistic representations, but their understanding remained purely academic. Clara watched a group of young people examine holographic displays showing elephants, lions and dolphins with the same detached interest they might show for dinosaurs or mythical creatures. These children had never heard birdsong, never seen a butterfly, never felt the warm breath of a horse or the soft fur of a cat. The underground society had achieved remarkable technological sophistication in their efforts to survive. Hydroponic gardens produced vegetables under artificial sunlight. Protein synthesis facilities created meat-like substances from engineered bacteria, and atmospheric processors maintained breathable air throughout the vast tunnel networks. But for all their technical achievements, Clara could see that something essential had been lost. The people moved with efficiency but not joy, spoke with knowledge but not wonder. They had preserved human life but not human spirit. Clara's most profound encounter came through a 12-year-old girl named Maya, whose intelligence and curiosity reminded Clara of herself at that age. Maya had been assigned to help Clara navigate the settlement, and their conversations revealed the depth of loss that the underground generation carried. What were they really like? Maya asked one day as they walked through the archives where thousands of hours of animal footage were stored. The old people tell us about pets, about how animals were friends with humans, but I don't understand how something could be your friend if it couldn't talk. Clara struggled to explain concepts that had been fundamental to her own childhood. The loyalty of dogs, the independence of cats, the beauty of bird flight, the majesty of wild animals in their natural habitats. Maya listened with fascination, but also with a sadness that broke Clara's heart. "I dream about them sometimes," Maya confided. "The animals. I dream that I'm walking on the surface and there are creatures everywhere, making sounds and moving around. But when I wake up, I know it's just my imagination making things up." The weight of responsibility settled on Clara's shoulders with crushing force. She possessed knowledge that could prevent this future, could ensure that Maya and millions like her would grow up in a world filled with life and wonder. But she was trapped in a time not her own, with no apparent way to return to the moment when history could still be changed. The temporal device that had brought her here was lost, possibly destroyed in the transition, leaving Clara stranded in a future she desperately wanted to undo. Clara's attempts to access historical records met with resistance from the settlement council. The underground society had built its stability on acceptance of their situation, and Clara's questions about the past threatened to disrupt the delicate psychological balance that kept their community functional. "We don't encourage dwelling on what might have been," explained Dr. Sarah Kim, the settlement's chief psychologist. "Our people have made peace with reality. Hope for impossible changes leads to despair and social instability." But Clara persisted, using her scientific credentials and knowledge of pre-dying biology to gain access to archived research data. Working late into the artificial nights in the settlement's digital libraries, she began to piece together the exact sequence of events that had led to the Great Dying. The pathogen had indeed originated from the livestock vaccine project she remembered from her own time, specifically from a genetic modification designed to improve the vaccine's effectiveness against respiratory diseases in cattle. The research records painted a picture of corporate negligence and regulatory failure that was both predictable and heartbreaking. Viridian Agricultural Solutions, a biotechnology company focused on livestock health, had developed their modified vaccine under tremendous pressure to bring it to market quickly. Early testing had shown unusual mutation patterns in the vaccine's viral components, but company scientists had dismissed these findings as laboratory artifacts with no real-world significance. The critical decision had come down to a single board meeting where Viridian's executives decided whether to delay the vaccine's release for additional safety testing. Market pressures, competitor threats, and investor expectations had all weighed against caution. The board voted to proceed with immediate distribution, overruling the concerns of their own research staff. Within months, the modified vaccine was being administered to cattle across 6 continents. Clara found records of the first mutation events, initially isolated incidents where the vaccine's viral components had recombined with natural pathogens to create something entirely new. These early cases were investigated by local health authorities, but never reported to international monitoring agencies. By the time the pattern became clear, the mutated pathogen had already spread beyond any possibility of containment. What made the story particularly tragic was how easily the disaster could have been prevented. A delay of even 6 months would have allowed Viridian scientists to identify and correct the genetic instability in their vaccine. More rigorous regulatory oversight would have caught the mutation risk before the vaccine reached the market. Simple precautionary principles, applied with the knowledge available at the time, could have saved every animal on Earth. Clara's research revealed the exact date and time of the crucial board meeting. March 15th, 2024, at 2 p.m. Pacific time. She had returned to the past just 5 days before that meeting, giving her a narrow window to prevent the decision that would doom the world's animals. But Clara faced an almost impossible challenge. How could she convince corporate executives and government regulators to abandon a profitable project based on evidence she couldn't possibly have obtained through normal channels? As Clara worked frantically in the archives, she discovered that the temporal device was not lost after all. The underground settlement's engineers had found the machine's remains scattered across the surface above their city, its components damaged but not destroyed by the temporal transition. Dr. James Wright, the settlement's leading physicist, had spent decades studying the device, trying to understand its principles and reconstruct its functionality. "We always hoped someone would come back," Wright explained as he showed Clara through his workshop, where the temporal device's components were carefully preserved. The mathematics suggested that time travel was possible, and we theorized that someone from the past might realize what was happening and try to change it. But the energy requirements for temporal displacement are enormous, and our power systems can only support a single transition. Wright's analysis confirmed Clara's worst fears and best hopes. The temporal device could indeed send her back to her own time, but only once. The underground settlement's entire power grid would have to be diverted to charge the machine's quantum field generators, leaving the city without energy for weeks, while their fusion reactors slowly rebuilt capacity. More critically, Wright couldn't guarantee that the device would send Clara to the exact moment she needed to reach. "The temporal targeting system was damaged in your arrival," Wright explained, pointing to scorched components that looked like modern art sculptures. "I can recalibrate it to approximate your original time period, but the margin of error could be significant. You might arrive weeks or months before the critical moment, or you might overshoot and arrive too late to change anything." Clara faced an agonizing decision. Staying in the future meant accepting the death of every animal on Earth, but preserving the lives and society of the people who had welcomed her into their underground world. Attempting to return to the past meant risking not just her own life, but potentially disrupting history in ways that might create an even worse future. And there was no guarantee that she would be able to convince anyone in her own time to take action based on her incredible story. The decision became clear when Maya approached Clara in the archives, carrying a hand-drawn picture of a forest filled with creatures the girl had never seen but had imagined based on historical records. "If you could really change things," Maya asked with the directness that only children possess, "would you make it so that animals were real again, even if it meant people like me were never born?" Clara realised that Maya had perfectly articulated the moral complexity of her situation. Changing the past would indeed mean that the underground society would never develop, that the specific people she had come to know and care about might never exist. But it would also mean that billions of animals would live, that ecosystems would thrive, that children would grow up in a world where beauty and wonder were part of everyday experience. "Yes," Clara told Maya, knowing that her answer condemned herself to loneliness, but offered hope to countless generations. "I would change things because the world is supposed to be full of life, and every child deserves to see that for themselves." The preparations for Clara's return took 3 days, during which the entire underground settlement worked together to prepare the temporal device. Clara spent her time documenting everything she had learned about the Great Dying, creating detailed records that she hoped would help her convince people in her own time to take action. She also worked with Dr. Wright to understand exactly how the vaccine's genetic modifications had created the conditions for the pathogen's mutation. On her final night in the underground city, Clara attended a gathering where the entire community came to say goodbye. These people had devoted their limited power resources and their hopes to sending her back to a past they would never see, trusting her to prevent their world from coming into existence. Children who had never seen stars gave her drawings of night skies. Adults who had never felt rain offered her poems about water falling from clouds. Chen spoke for the community. "We know that if you succeed, we will never exist as we are now. Our city, our culture, our individual lives, all of it will be erased from history. But we also know that the world you came from, the world you can restore, is more beautiful and more alive than anything we have ever known. That is our gift to the future, the sacrifice of our existence for the chance that life itself might continue." Clara entered the temporal device with tears in her eyes and the weight of 2 worlds on her shoulders. As the machine's field generators whined to life and the familiar white light began to fill the chamber, Clara held tight to Maya's drawing and Dr. Wright's technical specifications for the vaccine's genetic structure. She had one chance to save the future by changing the past, and failure would mean not just her own death, but the extinction of every animal on Earth. The transition back to her own time felt different from her original journey forward. Instead of the sensation of falling, Clara experienced a crushing pressure that seemed to compress her very atoms, followed by a stretching sensation as if she were being pulled apart by invisible forces. When consciousness returned, she found herself lying on the floor of her own laboratory, surrounded by the familiar equipment and computer displays she had left behind what seemed like a lifetime ago. But something was wrong with the scene around her. Clara's laboratory showed signs of activity that shouldn't have been there. Additional computer terminals, research materials she didn't recognize, personnel badges for people she had never met. As she struggled to her feet, Clara realized that the temporal transition had not returned her to the exact moment of her departure. The calendar displays showed that she had arrived 2 weeks after her disappearance, during which time the university had begun investigating her vanishing and reassigning her research projects. Clara's return created an immediate sensation throughout the research facility. Her colleagues had assumed she was dead, and her sudden reappearance raised questions that Clara couldn't possibly answer honestly. The university administration demanded explanations for her absence. The research funding agencies wanted to know about the status of her temporal mechanics project, and her fellow graduate students were curious about where she'd been for 2 weeks. Working frantically to establish credible cover stories, Clara claimed to have been conducting field research that had been interrupted by a hiking accident, leaving her stranded and injured with partial memory loss. The story was thin and wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny, but it bought her enough time to focus on the critical task ahead of her. According to her calculations, the Viridian Agricultural Solutions Board meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Clara's first challenge was gaining access to information about Viridian's vaccine project that she couldn't possibly have known through normal research channels. She spent the night in computer databases, scientific journals and corporate filings, trying to find legitimate sources for the knowledge she had gained in the future. Clara discovered that some information about the vaccine's genetic modifications had been published in obscure technical journals, though the mutation risks had been buried in supplementary data that few researchers would have examined carefully. More challenging was the question of how to present her concerns to people who would take them seriously. Clara's reputation as a temporal mechanics researcher gave her credibility in theoretical physics, but not in agricultural biotechnology. She needed to find allies within the relevant scientific community, people whose expertise and professional standing would lend weight to her warnings about the vaccine's dangers. Clara's breakthrough came through Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a veterinary epidemiologist whose research focused on disease transmission patterns in livestock populations. Rodriguez had actually published papers questioning the safety protocols for genetically modified livestock treatments, making her a natural ally for Clara's concerns about the Viridian vaccine. But convincing Rodriguez to take immediate action required Clara to reveal more about her knowledge than she was comfortable sharing. "The mutation patterns you're describing are theoretically possible," Rodriguez agreed, as she reviewed Clara's hastily prepared analysis. "But they seem unlikely based on the genetic modifications Viridian has published. Where are you getting this specific information about recombination sequences and cross-species transmission rates?" Clara had prepared for this question, but her answer still felt inadequate. "I've been running advanced computer simulations based on temporal progression modelling, essentially trying to predict how genetic systems might evolve over time under different environmental pressures. The results suggest that Viridian's modifications create precisely the conditions that could lead to catastrophic mutation events." Rodriguez studied Clara's data with the careful attention of a scientist who understood both the theoretical possibilities and the practical implications. "Even if you're right about the risks," she said finally, "convincing a major corporation to delay a product launch based on computer simulations would require extraordinary evidence. Viridian has invested millions of dollars in this vaccine, and they have regulatory approval from multiple agencies." Clara realized that preventing the vaccine's release would require more than scientific arguments. It would require political and economic pressure applied at the highest levels of corporate decision-making. She needed to create a crisis of confidence that would make Viridian's board meeting delay their approval, while additional safety testing was conducted. But Clara had less than 12 hours to orchestrate a campaign that might normally take months to develop. Working through the night, Clara contacted every relevant scientist, regulatory official, and advocacy organisation she could reach. She used her temporal mechanics research credentials to gain access to high-level meetings, her university's reputation to schedule emergency consultations, and her desperation to convince people that immediate action was necessary. Clara's story was that her computer models had identified a potential catastrophic failure mode in the Viridian vaccine, and that the company needed to be warned before they proceeded with full-scale distribution. The response to Clara's emergency campaign was mixed but encouraging. Several prominent epidemiologists agreed that the genetic modifications in Viridian's vaccine warranted additional scrutiny, even if they weren't convinced that the risks were as severe as Clara claimed. Regulatory agencies promised to review their approval processes, though they couldn't commit to any immediate changes in policy. Animal welfare organisations prepared to file emergency petitions that would at least create publicity around the vaccine's potential dangers. But Clara's most important breakthrough came through Dr. Michael Chen, a former Viridian researcher who had left the company after disagreeing with their safety protocols. Chen confirmed that there had indeed been internal debates about the vaccine's stability, and that some company scientists had expressed concerns about mutation risks that were ultimately overruled by management. With Chen's insider knowledge and Rodriguez's epidemiological expertise supporting her claims, Clara's warnings gained the credibility they needed to be taken seriously. The morning of the Viridian board meeting, Clara found herself in the surreal position of sitting in a conference room with corporate executives, government regulators, and scientific experts, knowing that the decisions made in the next few hours would determine the fate of every animal on Earth. Viridian's chief executive, Dr. Patricia Williams, presented the company's case for immediate vaccine distribution with the confidence of someone who had prepared for months to make this presentation. Clara's opportunity to speak came during the regulatory review portion of the meeting, when external experts were invited to comment on the vaccine's safety profile. Using the scientific data she had compiled and the expert testimony she had arranged, Clara presented a carefully structured argument about the potential for genetic instability in Viridian's modified viral components. The concern is not that these mutations are likely, Clara explained, displaying computer models on the conference room's presentation system, but that if they occur, the consequences could be unprecedented in scope. We're talking about the possibility of a pathogen that could adapt to any animal species, potentially threatening entire ecosystems. The economic cost of additional safety testing is negligible compared to the risk we're taking by proceeding without full understanding of these genetic modifications. Williams responded with the predictable corporate arguments about extensive testing, regulatory approval, and competitive pressures. But Clara noticed uncertainty in the faces of several board members, particularly when Dr. Chen described the internal scientific debates that had led to his departure from the company. The presentation of evidence continued for 3 hours, with experts on both sides offering increasingly technical arguments about genetic stability, mutation probabilities, and risk assessment methodologies. The critical moment came when Dr. Rodriguez presented epidemiological models showing how quickly a cross-species pathogen could spread in modern agricultural systems. If Dr. Wells's simulations are correct about the mutation potential, Rodriguez explained, we could see global transmission within months of the first recombination event. The interconnected nature of modern food production means that a single outbreak could spread faster than any containment measures we have available. Clara watched the faces of the board members as they processed the implications of Rodriguez's presentation. She could see the moment when abstract scientific discussions became concrete understanding of potential consequences. Williams continued to argue for proceeding with the vaccine's release, but her arguments increasingly focused on economic and competitive factors rather than scientific certainty about safety. The final vote was closer than Clara had dared to hope. 7 board members voted to delay the vaccine's release pending additional safety testing, while 5 voted to proceed with the original timeline. Williams accepted the decision with professional grace, announcing that Viridian would conduct an additional 6 months of stability testing before bringing the product to market. Clara left the meeting feeling simultaneously exhausted and elated. She had successfully prevented the decision that would have led to the Great Dying, ensuring that Viridian's vaccine would undergo the additional testing needed to identify and correct its genetic instabilities. The future that Maya and her underground community had described would never come to pass, replaced by a timeline where animals would continue to thrive on Earth's surface. But Clara's work was not yet complete. She wanted to verify that her intervention had actually changed the future, to see with her own eyes that the world she'd saved would indeed be different from the one she'd visited. Using the knowledge she'd gained from Dr. Dwight, Clara began rebuilding the temporal device, this time with proper safety protocols and targeting systems that would allow her to make controlled jumps forward in time. The reconstruction took several months, during which Clara continued to monitor Viridian's progress with their vaccine development. The additional safety testing revealed exactly the genetic instabilities that Clara had predicted, leading to significant modifications in the vaccine's design that eliminated the mutation risks. When the vaccine was finally released, it proved highly effective against livestock diseases while maintaining complete genetic stability. Clara's temporal device came online again in late 2024, nearly a year after her original accidental journey to the future. This time, she programmed the machine to make a brief reconnaissance trip forward to the year 2100, just long enough to verify that the world had indeed developed along different lines than the timeline she'd originally encountered. The future Clara discovered was radically different from the underground civilization she remembered. Earth's surface teemed with life. Birds filled the skies, forests covered the landscape, and oceans supported thriving ecosystems. Cities existed both above and below ground, but as choices of lifestyle rather than necessities of survival. Humanity had continued to develop advanced technologies, but in partnership with natural systems rather than as replacements for them. Yet Clara's brief exploration of this altered future revealed new challenges that her intervention had created. With animal populations continuing to thrive, ecological balance had become a critical concern. Some regions struggled with overpopulation of certain species, while others dealt with invasive animals that had adapted to human-modified environments. The abundance of life that Clara had preserved created its own complex problems that future humanity would need to solve. Clara realised that her role as a time traveller was not to create perfect futures, but to preserve humanity's opportunity to face and overcome whatever challenges arose. She had prevented one catastrophic outcome, but she could not eliminate the fundamental responsibility that each generation bears for the consequences of their choices. The future would always contain problems and difficulties. The important thing was ensuring that humanity retained the diversity and richness of life that would provide resources for addressing those challenges. Standing in a forest filled with the sounds of birds and insects, Clara understood that her intervention had been successful, not because it had created paradise, but because it had preserved possibility. Children in this timeline would grow up knowing the wonder of animal life, would develop relationships with other species, would inherit a world where biology and technology could work together to solve problems rather than create them. Clara returned to her own time with a profound sense of completion and an equally profound sense of responsibility. She knew that there would always be other critical decisions, other moments when humanity's future hung in the balance, other opportunities for wisdom or folly to shape the course of history. Her temporal device remained functional, offering the possibility of further interventions, but Clara also understood the dangers of excessive meddling with the natural flow of time. Instead, Clara chose to focus her efforts on education and advocacy within her own timeline, using her knowledge of potential futures to guide present-day decision-making. She became a leading voice in debates about biotechnology safety, environmental protection, and the precautionary principle in scientific research. Clara's unique perspective, informed by direct experience of one potential future, gave her insights that no amount of theoretical analysis could provide. Maya's drawing, which Clara had carried back from the underground future, became a reminder of what was at stake in humanity's choices about technology and environment. Though Maya herself would never exist in the timeline Clara had preserved, her dream of seeing real animals had been fulfilled for countless other children who would grow up in a world where such dreams were everyday reality rather than impossible fantasies. Clara often wondered about the people she had met in that underground future, Chen, Wright, Rodriguez, and especially Maya. Their sacrifice, giving up their own existence for the chance to preserve a more beautiful world, represented the highest form of human altruism. Clara carried their memory as a responsibility, knowing that her actions in the present would determine whether their gift would be honoured by the generations who would inherit the world she had helped to save. The temporal device remained in Clara's laboratory, a tool of incredible power that she used sparingly and with great caution. Clara had learned that changing the past was possible, but that each change created new uncertainties and new responsibilities. The future would always be shaped by the choices of the present, and the best any individual could do was to ensure that those choices were made with wisdom, compassion, and full awareness of their potential consequences. In quiet moments, Clara would sometimes activate the temporal device just long enough to glimpse potential futures, watching the branching possibilities that stretched ahead of humanity like an infinite garden of paths. Some futures were bright with promise, others dark with challenges, but all of them contained the fundamental elements that Clara had fought to preserve: life in all its diversity, beauty in all its forms, and the endless potential for growth, discovery and wonder that made existence itself a gift worth protecting. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The morning Dr. Elena Marrow disappeared from her own timeline began like any other. She arrived at the Meridian Physics Institute at 7:30, her usual time, carrying a thermos of coffee and a mind buzzing with calculations. The temporal scanner prototype hummed quietly in Laboratory 7, its chrome surface reflecting the early sunlight streaming through reinforced windows. Eleanor had spent 3 years perfecting the device, not for time travel, she reminded herself, but for temporal observation, a window into the past, nothing more. She never intended to step through that window. The scanner resembled a sleek metallic archway, its frame embedded with quantum processors and temporal field generators. Dr. Marcus Webb, her mentor and the project's director, had insisted on this morning's test despite Helena's reservations about the unstable quantum matrices. The device was meant to project images from the past onto a viewing screen, allowing historians to witness events firsthand without the contamination of physical presence. Revolutionary, but safe. Eleanor ran her final diagnostics, her fingers dancing across holographic displays. Energy readings fluctuated wildly. The temporal field was unstable, chaotic even. She reached for her communication device to postpone the test when the scanner activated itself. The world exploded into light. When Elena's vision cleared, she stood in the same laboratory, but everything had changed. Dust covered every surface inches thick. The walls bore massive cracks that spiderwebbed across the ceiling. Vines had somehow grown through the reinforced concrete, their leaves an unnatural silver colour that seemed to shift between seasons, budding, flowering, dying, and budding again in an endless cycle. She stumbled outside and gasped. The city of New Geneva stretched before her, but it was wrong. Victorian brownstones sat beside towering glass spires that hadn't existed in her time. Medieval castles occupied spaces where shopping centres should have been. A section of downtown flickered like a broken hologram, alternating between a bustling Roman marketplace and the skeletal remains of some futuristic metropolis. In the distance, she could see what appeared to be Egyptian pyramids, their surfaces gleaming with technology that definitely wasn't ancient. The sky itself was fractured. Day and night existed simultaneously in different quadrants, separated by jagged lines of aurora that pulsed with temporal energy. In one section, 3 moons hung in a starless void. In another, twin suns blazed over a landscape of impossible geometry. Eleanor's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto what had once been a sidewalk, but now appeared to be cobblestones that occasionally morphed into metallic grating. This wasn't the future she had expected. This wasn't any future that should have been possible. "First time seeing the collapse?" a voice asked behind her. Eleanor spun around to find a woman approaching, but something was immediately wrong with her appearance. She wore a Victorian dress of deep burgundy, complete with bustle and high collar, but her left arm was entirely mechanical, a sleek prosthetic that hummed with advanced servos. Her face was young, perhaps 25, but her eyes held the weariness of centuries. "I'm Victoria Chen," the woman said, extending her organic hand. "Or I was, in 1887. Now I'm not sure what I am." "Eleanor Marrow," she replied shakily, accepting the handshake. "What happened here? What is this place?" Victoria's laugh held no humour. "This is what's left of reality. Welcome to the aftermath of humanity's greatest mistake, time travel." Elena's blood turned cold. "That's impossible. We never invented time travel. The scanner was just for observation." "Your scanner," Victoria interrupted, "was the prototype that started this nightmare. Come with me. There are others you need to meet, and not much time before the next flux wave hits." Victoria led Elena through streets that defied comprehension. Buildings aged decades in seconds, then reversed the process. A fountain in the town square flowed upward, its water crystallizing into ice before exploding back into droplets. People moved through this chaos with practiced resignation, some in medieval armor, others in clothing Elena didn't recognize. A few in spacesuits that seemed to be keeping them alive in pockets of temporal void. They entered what had once been the city library, its classical columns now supporting a roof that appeared to be made of pure energy. Inside, dozens of people from different eras had created a makeshift community. A knight in chainmail shared a meal with a woman whose skin had a metallic sheen and circuits visible beneath the surface. Children from various centuries played together, their laughter creating small bubbles of temporal stability around them. "These are the chrono-refugees," Victoria explained. "People torn from their proper timelines when the collapse began. Some of us remember our original lives. Others don't remember anything before the chaos." An elderly man approached them, his beard white as snow but his eyes sharp with intelligence. He wore robes that seemed to shift between the simple cloth of a monk and the complex materials of some advanced civilization. "This is Brother Benedict," Victoria said. "He's our historian, though his timeline of origin is complicated." Benedict studied Elena with interest. "You're from the origin point, aren't you? The 21st century?" Elena nodded, still struggling to process what she was seeing. "Then you must understand," Benedict continued, "that time is not a river, as your scientist believed. It's more like a web, with each strand connected to every other strand. When your people created that first temporal device, you didn't just observe the past, you connected to it, and every connection created a paradox." He gestured to the walls around them, which were covered in what Elena initially mistook for artwork, but now realized were charts, diagrams and equations written in dozens of different languages and scientific notations from across history. "We call it the Chrono Codex," Benedict explained. "Everything we've learned about the collapse, compiled by refugees from across time. The first paradox was small, a single photon displaced from its proper temporal position. But paradoxes multiply exponentially. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 16, and so on." Elena studied the equations, her trained mind beginning to grasp the horrific implications. "But that means—" "Yes," Victoria said grimly. "Every attempt to observe the past created new contradictions. Every new contradiction destabilized more of the timeline. Within a century of your first experiment, causality itself began to break down." Benedict led them deeper into the library, past groups of refugees trying to maintain some semblance of normal life in the chaos. They reached a vault-like room where the walls were covered in what appeared to be screens, but Elena realized they were actually windows into different time periods. "This is where we keep the worst of it," Benedict said. the temporal wounds that never heal. Eleanor approached one of the windows and nearly screamed. Through it, she could see a battle that never ended, the same soldiers dying and being reborn every few seconds, trapped in an infinite loop of violence. Another window showed a city where time moved backward, children aging into elderly people before becoming young again in an endless cycle of reversed causality. The paradox zones, Victoria explained, places where time became so tangled that it lost all meaning. Some refugees come from there. They're different. Their memories exist in multiple states simultaneously. They remember being born and dying at the same time. Eleanor's scientific mind reeled. This wasn't just temporal displacement. This was the complete breakdown of linear causality. She thought of her mentor, Dr. Webb, his excitement about the scanner's potential, his dismissal of her concerns about quantum stability. "My mentor," she whispered, "Marcus Webb. He pushed for the experiments even when I warned him about the instabilities." Benedict and Victoria exchanged a dark look. "Dr. Webb," Benedict said slowly, "is mentioned frequently in our records. According to the historical fragments we've recovered, he became obsessed with temporal manipulation after the first successful observation. He built dozens of devices, each more powerful than the last." Victoria nodded. The refugees from later periods tell stories about him. By the end, he was trying to use time travel to make himself immortal, jumping between timelines to avoid death. Each jump made the collapse worse. Elena felt sick. Her mentor, the man who'd guided her career, had apparently become the architect of reality's destruction, and she had helped him build the first device. A low rumble shook the building, and everyone in the library immediately began moving with practiced urgency. "Flux wave," Victoria called out. "Everyone to the stability zones." Eleanor watched in amazement as the refugees sorted themselves into groups and hurried to different sections of the building. Some areas were marked with symbols she didn't recognize, others with equations that looked almost like her own work. "The building exists in multiple time states," Benedict explained as they hurried to a corner marked with a complex mathematical formula Eleanor recognized as a temporal stabilization equation. Different sections are anchored to different periods. During flux waves, we have to match our temporal signature to the most stable zone available. They huddled together as the wave passed through. Eleanor felt it like a physical force, a sensation of falling sideways through time itself. Images flashed before her eyes. The laboratory as it had been in her time, then as it might have been in different timelines, then as it was now in ruins. For a moment, she saw herself as an old woman, as a child, as someone she'd never been and would never be. When the wave passed, several refugees had simply vanished. "Where did they go?" Elena asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "Dispersed," Victoria said sadly. "Sometimes the waves tear people from their temporal anchors completely. They don't die. They just cease to have ever existed." Eleanor's hands were shaking now. The magnitude of what her work had unleashed was beyond comprehension. Entire civilizations lost a paradox. Billions of people scattered across impossible timelines or erased from existence entirely. "There has to be a way to fix this," she said desperately. "Some way to reverse the damage." Benedict looked at her with something like pity. "We've been trying for subjective centuries. Some of us have been here so long we've forgotten what linear time feels like. The collapse is self-perpetuating now. Every moment that passes creates new paradoxes." "But there might be one way," Victoria added quietly. "It's never been attempted because it would require someone from the origin point. Someone who understands the original technology. Eleanor's heart raced. What do you mean? Victoria and Benedict led her to another section of the library, this one filled with devices that looked like they'd been cobbled together from technology spanning millennia. Steam-powered computers sat beside quantum processors, and everything was connected by cables that seemed to phase in and out of visibility. We call it the anchor engine, Benedict explained. Theoretically, it could stabilize someone's temporal signature long enough for them to travel back to the origin point and prevent the first experiment. Elena studied the bizarre machine. She could see elements of her own temporal scanner design incorporated into its structure, along with technologies she couldn't even begin to understand. The problem, Victoria continued, is that using it is almost certainly fatal. The temporal stresses involved in travelling backward through a collapsing timeline would tear apart anyone who wasn't perfectly synchronised with the original paradox. And even if it worked, Benedict added, changing the origin point would erase this timeline entirely. Everyone you've met here, everything we've built, none of it would ever have existed. Eleanor stared at the machine, understanding the impossible choice before her. She could return to her own time and prevent the collapse, but doing so would erase all these people who had shown her kindness, who had built a community in the ruins of reality itself, people who existed only because of the disaster she had helped create. But the alternative was letting the collapse continue, watching reality tear itself apart until nothing remained but paradox and chaos. Before she could voice her decision, another sound filled the library. Not the low rumble of a flux wave, but something far worse. It was a roar that seemed to come from time itself, accompanied by a grinding noise like the universe's gears slipping. "Paradox beast," Victoria whispered, her face pale with terror. Through the library's windows, Eleanor saw something that defied description approaching. It looked like a creature made of fractured time itself. Parts of it were ancient and decaying, other parts were newborn, and still other parts flickered between different states of existence. It had too many eyes, all of them showing different time periods, and when it moved, reality warped around it. "They're drawn to temporal anomalies," Benedict explained as they backed away from the windows. "The larger the paradox, the more dangerous they become. And you," he looked at Elena, "are the ultimate paradox. Someone from the origin point existing in the collapsed timeline." The creature smashed through the library's wall with casual ease. Its roar was the sound of history breaking, and Eleanor could feel it in her bones. Several refugees screamed as the beast presence created micro-paradoxes around them, aging them decades in seconds or reverting them to children. "The anchor engine!" Victoria shouted over the chaos. "It's the only way!" Eleanor didn't hesitate. She ran to the bizarre machine and began working to activate it, her fingers flying over controls that spanned centuries of technological development. Behind her, she could hear the paradox beast tearing through the library, its very presence unravelling the refugees' carefully maintained stability. The machine hummed to life, its temporal field generators creating a bubble of stable time around Elena. She could feel the device scanning her quantum signature, matching it to the original paradox that had brought her here. The process was agonizing. Every cell in her body felt like it was being torn apart and reassembled. "Elena!" Victoria called out. "The beast! It's coming this way!" Eleanor looked back to see the creature bearing down on her, its fractured form leaving trails of temporal distortion in the air. She had seconds before it reached her, seconds before its presence would destabilize the anchor engine completely. With no time left, she activated the return sequence. Reality exploded into fragments around her. She experienced every moment of her life simultaneously. Her childhood, her education, her work on the scanner, her journey to this collapsed future. But she also experienced moments that had never happened. Alternate versions of her life where she'd made different choices, where the scanner had never been built, where she had never been born at all. Then, mercifully, everything went dark. Elena awakened in her apartment, morning sunlight streaming through familiar windows. For a moment she thought the entire experience had been a dream. Then she looked at her clock and realized she was back. 3 days before the first scanner test. She had 3 days to prevent the end of the world. Eleanor raced to the laboratory, her mind still reeling with memories of the collapsed future. Dr. Webb was already there, making final adjustments to the scanner. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with enthusiasm. "Elena, perfect timing. I've made some modifications to the quantum matrix. We should be able to push the temporal range much further than originally planned." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Those modifications, she remembered Benedict mentioning them in the Chrono Codex. They were what transformed the scanner from a simple observation device into the paradox engine that would destroy causality itself. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I think we should postpone the test. I've been running simulations and there are some stability issues." "Nonsense," Webb interrupted, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "Elena, do you understand what we're on the verge of achieving? We won't just be able to observe history, we'll be able to interact with it. Change it, if necessary." Elena realized with growing horror that her mentor had always intended to build a time machine. The scanner had just been the first step, a way to test temporal manipulation without arousing suspicion from the oversight board. "Marcus, you can't," she pleaded. "The paradoxes alone would." "Would what?" Webb's expression hardened. "Elena, I'm disappointed. I thought you understood the magnitude of our work. The applications are limitless. We could prevent wars, cure diseases, even eliminate death itself by jumping between timelines." Elena stared at him, seeing not her mentor, but the man who had become obsessed with immortality, who would build device after device until reality itself collapsed. The kind, brilliant professor who had guided her career was already gone, replaced by ambition and hubris. She spent the next 2 days trying to convince Webb to abandon the test, but he was immovable. Worse, he had the backing of both the university and several government agencies who saw the scanner's military potential. Elena's warnings about paradoxes and temporal instability were dismissed as pre-test jitters. On the morning of the test, Eleanor made her final play. She arrived at the laboratory early and began sabotaging the scanner's quantum processors. If she couldn't convince Webb to stop, she would make it impossible for the device to function. She was deep in the scanner's control systems when Webb arrived with the security team. "I'm sorry, Elena," he said sadly. "I know you've been working against the project. The security cameras recorded everything." Elena looked up at the guards, realizing she had failed. In a few hours the scanner would activate, the first paradox would form, and the slow collapse of reality would begin. But then she noticed something. The guards were keeping their distance from the scanner itself. The device's temporal field was already affecting local space-time, creating minor distortions that made people uncomfortable. Elena smiled grimly. Webb might have caught her sabotaging the processors, but he didn't know about the feedback loop she'd created in the field generators. The scanner would still activate, but instead of opening a stable viewing portal, it would overload catastrophically. The demonstration proceeded as planned. Government officials, university administrators, and senior faculty gathered in the observation booth, while Webb proudly explained the scanner's capabilities. Eleanor was escorted to a chair in the front row, treated as an honoured guest despite her attempts at sabotage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb announced, "you're about to witness the first glimpse into history itself. Behold, the past." He activated the scanner. For a moment it worked exactly as designed. The archway filled with swirling temporal energy, and images began to form, glimpses of the laboratory as it had existed years before, then decades and centuries. Eleanor saw the land before the building was constructed, saw forests and meadows stretching into the distance. Then the feedback loop triggered. The scanner's hum became a shriek. The images in the archway began to fracture and multiply. Instead of showing one timeline, it was trying to display all possible timelines simultaneously. The temporal field expanded beyond its containment, washing over everyone in the room. Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of being pulled through time, but this time she was ready for it. As reality dissolved around her, she used her knowledge of the device's workings to guide her temporal trajectory. Instead of being pulled forward into the collapsed future, she pushed herself backward, deeper into the past, to the moment when the scanner's components were first being manufactured. She materialized in a factory where the scanner's quantum processors were being assembled. Moving quickly, she introduced subtle flaws into the manufacturing process, tiny imperfections that would make it impossible to achieve the quantum coherence necessary for temporal manipulation. The processors would function perfectly for normal applications, but any attempt to breach the time barrier would result in immediate failure. She repeated this process at dozens of facilities, sabotaging every component that would eventually be used to build temporal technology. She altered research notes, introduced false data into quantum mechanics databases, and even arranged for key researchers to receive job offers that would take them away from temporal research. It was exhausting work that took her across decades of time, but eventually Elena was satisfied. No one in her era would be able to build a working temporal device for at least another century. By then, perhaps humanity would have gained enough wisdom to understand the dangers. As the scanner's overload finally consumed itself, Elena felt herself being pulled back to her own time. But this time, it was different. She was returning to a timeline where the scanner had never worked, where temporal research had been abandoned as an impossibility decades earlier. Eleanor opened her eyes to find herself lying on the floor of Laboratory 7. Dr. Webb was kneeling beside her, his face creased with concern. Around them, the remains of the scanner smoked quietly, its components fused into uselessness by the overload. "Elena, are you all right?" Webb asked. "The scanner malfunctioned during the test. Some kind of quantum cascade failure." Eleanor sat up slowly, her head spinning. The laboratory looked exactly as it had before her journey to the collapsed future, but she could sense the difference. The oppressive weight of impending paradox was gone. Time flowed naturally, unmarked by the temporal scarring that had existed in the other timeline. "The project?" she asked carefully. "What happens now?" Webb sighed and looked at the ruined device. "I'm afraid this setback will kill the funding." The oversight board was already skeptical, and after this failure, he shrugged. "Perhaps it's for the best. I've been having some doubts about the ethical implications of temporal research." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the man she'd once known, brilliant but cautious, ambitious but ethical. Without the scanner's success to feed his obsession, he remained the mentor she remembered. Over the following weeks, Eleanor watched as temporal research was quietly abandoned. The theoretical foundations she had sabotaged decades earlier made it clear that time travel was impossible, and after the scanner's spectacular failure, no one was willing to fund further experiments. She returned to her work in standard physics, publishing papers on quantum mechanics and relativity that would help advance human knowledge in safer directions. Sometimes, late at night, she would remember fragments of the collapsed timeline, Victoria's mechanical arm, Benedict's ancient eyes, the sight of cities flickering between centuries. She was the only person who remembered the refugees, the paradox beasts, the slow dissolution of causality itself. Sometimes the weight of those memories felt unbearable. She had saved reality, but at the cost of erasing people who had shown her kindness and courage in the face of impossible circumstances. But then she would see a child playing in the park, or watch the sunset paint the sky in natural colours, unmarred by temporal distortions, and she would know she had made the right choice. Years passed. Eleanor established herself as a respected physicist, though she carefully avoided any research that might lead back to temporal manipulation. She watched her younger colleagues make discoveries and propose theories, always alert for any sign that someone might stumble onto the principles that could restart the path to temporal disaster. On the 20th anniversary of the scanner incident, Eleanor was preparing to retire. She had spent 2 decades as guardian of a secret no one else could know, protector of a timeline that everyone else took for granted. She was tired, ready to pass the responsibility to time itself. That evening, as she was cleaning out her office, a young graduate student knocked on her door. Elena recognized her, Sarah Chen, one of the brightest students in the quantum physics program. "Dr. Marrow," Sarah said excitedly. "I was hoping to discuss my thesis proposal with you. I've been working on some theoretical frameworks for temporal observation, and I think I might have found a way to make it work." Eleanor's blood froze. She looked at the equations Sarah was showing her, and her heart sank. They were different from her own work, approached from a completely different theoretical angle, but Elena could see where they would lead. Given enough time and resources, these theories could result in a working temporal device. Elena thought of Victoria and Benedict, of the chrono-refugees building their community in the ruins of causality. She thought of the paradox beasts and the temporal wounds that never healed. She thought of a future where time itself had collapsed into chaos. "Sarah," she said gently, "have you considered the philosophical implications of temporal observation? The ethical questions involved in witnessing events that the participants believed were private?" Sarah's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "I hadn't really thought about that aspect." Elena spent the next hour carefully guiding the young woman towards safer research directions, planting seeds of doubt about temporal research without being too obvious about it. By the time Sarah left, she was excited about pursuing quantum computing applications instead. Eleanor locked her office door and walked out into the evening air. The stars shone clearly overhead, unmarked by the temporal distortions that would have existed in the collapsed timeline. She had bought humanity another generation, maybe 2. But as she walked home, Elena wondered if she was fighting an inevitable battle. Curiosity was part of human nature. Someone, somewhere, would eventually develop the theories and technologies necessary for temporal manipulation. The knowledge was too alluring, the potential applications too tempting. Perhaps the real lesson wasn't that time travel should never be invented, but that humanity needed to mature before it could safely handle such power. The refugees in the collapsed timeline had shown remarkable resilience and compassion despite their circumstances. Maybe, given enough time to grow and learn, humanity could eventually develop temporal technology without destroying themselves. Elena reached her apartment and paused on the threshold, looking back at the city lights stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere in the quantum foam of possibility, another timeline existed where the scanner had worked, where she had travelled forward to witness the collapse of causality itself. In that timeline, brave people were still fighting to survive in the ruins of time. She'd given them the greatest gift she could. She'd made their suffering unnecessary. They would never exist to experience the collapse, would never need to build communities in the shattered remnants of reality, would never face the terror of paradox beasts or temporal flux waves. It was, she realized, the ultimate act of love. To sacrifice an entire timeline of connections and friendships to preserve the natural order of existence. Elena opened her door and stepped inside, carrying with her the memories of a future that would never come to pass and the knowledge that time for now was safe. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The headlamp beam cut through the dusty air like a knife, illuminating the rough-hewn walls of the abandoned mineshaft. Dr. Alex Chen adjusted the straps of their pack and took another step deeper into the mountain's belly. The Sierra Nevada had kept this secret for over a century and a half, but Alex's research had finally led them here, to the forgotten Whitmore claim, sealed off since 1851 when 3 miners vanished without a trace. "Just another ghost story," Alex muttered, but the words felt hollow in the oppressive silence. Their breath misted in the cold air as they pressed forward, following the narrow gauge rails that had once carried ore carts laden with California gold. The wood was rotted now, the iron rails eaten away by rust, but the tunnel itself remained remarkably intact. Alex had spent 15 years exploring caves and abandoned mines across the American West, documenting the remnants of frontier ambition for their dissertation on 19th century mining techniques. This particular shaft had been a challenge to locate, buried beneath decades of rockfall and deliberately obscured by the mining company that had abandoned it. The official records claimed it was a dry hole, worthless, but local legend spoke of something else entirely. The tunnel curved to the right, and Alex's light caught something that made them pause. There, embedded in the wall at eye level, was a vein of quartz unlike anything they'd seen before. The milky stone seemed to catch and hold the LED light, refracting it into prismatic patterns that danced across the rough surface. But it was what ran through the quartz that took Alex's breath away. Threads of gold so pure they seemed to glow with their own inner fire. "Jesus," Alex whispered, moving closer. The vein was narrow but rich, probably worth a fortune even by today's standards. How had the original miners missed this? They ran their gloved fingers along the stone, feeling the subtle warmth that seemed to emanate from within. Something metallic caught the light deeper in the vein. Alex angled their headlamp and saw it. An old pickaxe, its wooden handle dark with age, wedged so deep into the rock it seemed to have grown there. The metal head bore the marks of repeated use, and strange symbols had been carved into the handle, crude letters that spelled out Smorgon 1849. Alex pulled out their camera to document the find, but something about the scene felt wrong. The air in the tunnel had grown thick and oppressive, charged with an energy that made the hair on their arms stand on end. The quartz veins seemed to pulse with that strange inner light, and the temperature had risen noticeably. Just adrenaline, Alex told themselves, but their hands shook as they reached for the pickaxe handle. The moment their fingers closed around the weathered wood, the world changed. The rock beneath their feet began to tremble, a low rumble that started deep in the earth and built to a roar. Dust rained from the ceiling as the tunnel walls began to crack. Alex yanked on the pickaxe, trying to free it from the vein, and the quartz exploded in a shower of light and stone. The collapse came fast and violent. Support timbers groaned and snapped as tons of rock crashed down. Alex threw themselves backward, away from the falling debris, but there was nowhere to run. The air itself seemed to shimmer and bend, reality warping like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Colours bled together, sounds stretched and compressed, and then everything went black. The taste of blood and grit filled Alex's mouth as consciousness returned. Sunlight, actual sunlight, streamed through gaps in what remained of the tunnel entrance. They sat up slowly, head spinning, and tried to make sense of what they saw. The collapsed shaft looked different somehow. The walls were rougher, the support timbers newer despite being clearly handmade rather than machine-cut. And the sounds drifting in from outside were all wrong. Men's voices shouting, the creak of wagon wheels, the ring of metal on stone. Alex stumbled toward the light, climbing over debris that hadn't been there minutes before. Their modern hiking boots found purchase on rocks that felt somehow more real, more solid than they should. The headlamp had been lost in the collapse, but natural light guided them forward to what had once been the mine entrance. What they saw when they emerged froze the blood in their veins. A sprawling tent city stretched across the valley below, hundreds of canvas shelters arranged in rough rows along a muddy main street. Men in wool shirts and canvas pants moved between the structures, some carrying pickaxes and shovels, others hauling wooden buckets of water from a creek that ran crystal clear through the centre of the settlement. Smoke rose from countless small fires, and the air carried the scent of coffee, bacon grease, and unwashed humanity. "What the hell?" Alex breathed. But the words were lost in the cacophony drifting up from the camp. Someone was playing a fiddle badly, and the off-key melody mixed with drunken laughter and heated arguments about claim boundaries. A man leading a mule laden with supplies looked up and spotted Alex standing at the mine entrance. He wore a battered felt hat and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. His clothes were rough homespun, patched in multiple places, and his boots were held together with rope and determination. "You there," he called out, his voice carrying a thick Irish accent. "That your claim up there?" Alex opened their mouth to answer, then realised they had no idea what to say. The man was already climbing the slope toward them, the mule following reluctantly behind. As he drew closer, Alex could see the suspicion in his weathered face. "Ain't seen you before," the man said, stopping a few feet away. His eyes took in Alex's appearance, the synthetic fabric jacket, the modern hiking boots, the clean-shaven face and well-maintained gear. "Where you from, stranger?" San Francisco," Alex managed, the lie coming instinctively. Something was very wrong here, but they couldn't put their finger on what. The man laughed, a harsh sound. "San Francisco? Well now, that's a long walk from the city. You got papers for that claim?" He gestured toward the mine entrance. "Because if you don't, there's plenty here who'd be happy to jump it." Claim jumping. Alex's blood chilled as the term registered. They'd read about it in their research. The violent practice of stealing another man's mining claim, often at gunpoint. But that was history, something from the 1850s. This had to be some kind of historical reenactment, except the smell of unwashed bodies and wood smoke was too real. The weight of the pickaxe still clutched in their hand too solid. "The name's Murphy," the man said, apparently taking Alex's silence for wariness rather than confusion. "Been working the creek down there for 3 months now. Barely pulling enough dust to keep body and soul together." He spat in the dirt. "You best get yourself down to the recorder's office if you want to make that claim legal. And you might want to lose some of that fancy gear. Makes you look like a greenhorn, and greenhorns don't last long in these parts." Alex looked down at themselves, really seeing their appearance for the first time. The Gore-Tex jacket and hiking pants might as well have been a neon sign advertising their foreignness to this place and time. If this wasn't a reenactment, and the growing certainty in their gut said it wasn't, then they were in serious danger. "Much obliged for the advice," Alex said, trying to match Murphy's rough speech patterns. "Been travelling light, you understand." Murphy nodded, though his suspicion hadn't entirely faded. "Well, you best get sorted before dark. Claim jumpers do their work in shadow, and there's been more than a few disappearances lately." He turned to go, then paused. "Word of advice? Stay clear of Harlan Pike and his boys. They've been eyeing every new claim with hungry looks, if you catch my meaning." The Irishman headed back down the slope, leaving Alex alone with their growing terror. They looked around desperately, trying to find some sign that this was all an elaborate hoax, or a hallucination brought on by the cave-in. But everything felt too real. The bite of cold mountain air, the distant sound of pickaxes ringing against stone, the ache in their muscles from the collapse. Somehow, impossibly, they had travelled back in time. The date carved on the pickaxe handle suddenly took on new meaning. 1849, the height of the California gold rush, when tens of thousands of men had poured into the Sierra Nevada in search of fortune, armed with nothing but dreams and determination. Alex retreated into the mouth of the collapsed mine, their mind racing. They needed to think, to plan, to figure out how to survive in a world that had no concept of antibiotics, women's rights, or due process of law. Their modern clothing would mark them as an outsider, potentially dangerous in a community built on suspicion and greed. With shaking hands, they stripped off the Gore-Tex jacket and stuffed it behind a fallen rock, along with their backpack and its telltale collection of 21st century gear. The hiking boots would have to stay. Their feet wouldn't survive long in this rough country without proper footwear, but they could pass for work boots in poor light. The pickaxe felt heavy in their hands, its weight both foreign and familiar. Alex had used similar tools during archaeological digs, though never for the brutal work of hard rock mining. The carved initials, S. Morgan, seemed to pulse with significance. Had this Samuel Morgan been the man who'd caused the time rift? Had he travelled through time as Alex had? The sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks, painting the camp below in shades of gold and amber. Smoke from cooking fires rose straight up in the still air, and the sounds of the settlement took on a different character as men returned from their claims for the day. There was laughter, but it held an edge of desperation. These were men balanced on the knife's edge between fortune and ruin, where a day's bad luck could mean starvation. Alex had no choice but to go down there, to try to blend in among the 49ers until they could figure out how to get home. The collapsed mine behind them might hold the key, the strange quartz vein and its otherworldly properties, but they would need supplies, information and allies to explore it safely. The main street of the camp was a muddy thoroughfare lined with canvas-walled establishments that proclaimed themselves to be saloons, general stores and boarding houses. Men in rough clothing moved between them, some clearly drunk despite the early hour, others conducting business with the serious intensity of those who understood that time was money and money was survival. Alex approached a tent with a hand-painted sign that read Morgan's General Merchandise and felt their hearts skip. The same name as the one carved on the pickaxe. It couldn't be a coincidence. The tent's interior was cramped and dimly lit by oil lamps. Shelves made from rough planks held everything a miner might need. Canned food, tools, coffee, sugar, ammunition. Behind the makeshift counter stood a man in his 40s with greying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Help you?" he asked, looking Alex up and down with the same suspicion Murphy had shown. "Looking for some supplies," Alex said carefully, "and maybe some information. You wouldn't happen to be Samuel Morgan, would you?" The man's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "Depends who's asking. You a lawman? 'Cause I ain't done nothing that needs a lawman's attention." "No, nothing like that. Found this up at the old mine." Alex held up the pickaxe, watching as Samuel's face went pale. "Has your initials on it. Thought you might want it back." Samuel moved around the counter with surprising speed, snatching the pickaxe from Alex's hands. He examined the carved initials with shaking fingers, then looked up with eyes full of something between hope and terror. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked quietly. "The Whitmore claim, up the slope from here. Mine collapsed while I was exploring it." "Jesus," Samuel whispered. He looked around the tent as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned close. "You see anything else up there? Anything unusual?" Alex's pulse quickened. "What kind of unusual? The kind that ain't natural, the kind that makes a man question everything he knows about the world." Samuel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I lost this pickaxe 6 months ago, up in that mine, went in to explore a promising vein, and things got strange. Next thing I knew, I was lying at the bottom of a ravine 3 miles away, with no memory of how I got there." "Tell me about the vein," Alex pressed. "What did it look like?" Samuel's eyes darted around the tent again. "Quartz, but not like any I'd seen before. It seemed to glow with its own light, warm to the touch. And the gold, Christ, the gold was like nothing I'd ever seen, pure as angels' tears and bright as the sun." It was the same vein Alex had found, the same impossible mineral formation that had somehow torn a hole in time itself. But Samuel's story suggested the phenomenon had been active for months, maybe longer. How many other miners had stumbled across it? How many had vanished without explanation? "I tried to go back," Samuel continued, "but the mine was sealed up tight. Rockfall, they said. Dangerous. But I know what I saw in there, and I know there's more gold than a man could carry in a lifetime. And you never tried to dig it out?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "With what? I barely make enough from this store to keep food on the table, and even if I could afford a proper crew, there's been talk. Strange talk about that mine. Men say it's cursed, that the gold in there belongs to the dead. Before Alex could respond, voices outside the tent grew loud and angry. Samuel's face went white as he recognised one of them. "Pike," he muttered. "You best make yourself scarce, friend. Harlan Pike ain't the forgiving sort, and if he thinks you got information about hidden gold..." The tent flap burst open, and 3 men pushed inside. The leader was tall and lean, with the kind of predatory smile that never reached his eyes. His clothes were better quality than most in the camp, and the gun on his hip looked well maintained and frequently used. "Samuel," he said pleasantly, but his voice carried an undertone of menace. "Heard you had a visitor. Someone asking about old mining claims." "Just selling supplies, Harlan," Samuel replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Same as always." Pike's attention turned to Alex, and they felt the weight of a killer's scrutiny. "Don't believe we've been introduced. Name's Harlan Pike. I make it my business to know everyone who comes and goes in this camp." "Just passing through," Alex said, meeting Pike's stare. "Looking to try my luck at the diggings." "Is that so?" Pike moved closer, and Alex caught the smell of whiskey and tobacco on his breath. Funny thing about luck, it tends to run out when you're not careful about who you trust. His eyes flicked to the pickaxe in Samuel's hands. "That's an interesting tool you got there, Sam. Looks old. Valuable, maybe." "Just an old pickaxe," Samuel said, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the handle. Pike's smile widened. "Course it is. Well, I'll be seeing you both around. Small camp like this. Hard to keep secrets." He tipped his hat mockingly and sauntered out, his men following like shadows. The silence that followed was heavy with menace. Samuel carefully set the pickaxe behind the counter and wiped sweat from his forehead. "You got to understand," he said quietly. "Pike and his boys control half the claims in this valley. They don't mine, they take, and they got eyes and ears everywhere. If they think the pickaxe is connected to something valuable, they'll come after both of us," Alex finished. Samuel nodded grimly. "You need to leave, tonight. Head down to Sacramento, maybe, or over to Stockton, anywhere but here." But Alex couldn't leave, not yet. The mine held the key to getting home, and they wouldn't get another chance to explore it with Pike watching their every move. "What if I told you I knew a way to get to that gold? A way that wouldn't require digging through tons of rock?" Samuel's eyes narrowed. "I'd say you were either lying or crazy. Maybe both. The mine's not completely collapsed. There's still a way in if you know where to look. But I'd need help, and supplies, and someone who knows these mountains." "Even if that were true," Samuel said, "it'd be suicide. Pike's got men watching that claim, waiting for someone stupid enough to try their luck. They'd shoot us down like dogs." Alex leaned across the counter. "What if I told you the gold in that mine isn't like anything you've ever seen? What if I told you it's enough to buy your way out of this camp, out of this life forever?" Samuel stared at them for a long moment, weighing greed against fear. Finally he spoke. "What exactly are you proposing?" "One night. Give me one night in that mine, and I'll split whatever we find 50-50. All I need is some basic supplies and someone to watch my back." "And if Pike's men find us?" Alex touched the gun belt they'd lifted from their pack. A Colt revolver their grandfather had given them, an antique that would be cutting-edge technology in 1849. "Then we make sure they regret it." Samuel's eyes fixed on the gun with newfound respect. "You know how to use that thing?" "Well enough." Alex hoped their voice sounded more confident than they felt. They'd done some target shooting with the antique Colt, but putting holes in paper targets was a far cry from facing down armed men in a life-or-death situation. The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Samuel closed his store early and gathered supplies, rope, lanterns, tools, and enough food for several days. Alex contributed what they could from their hidden modern gear, careful to explain each item as something acquired in San Francisco. As full darkness fell over the camp, they made their way up the slope toward the sealed mine. The settlement below them glowed with the warm light of oil lamps and campfires, but the surrounding mountains were black as pitch. Somewhere in that darkness, Pike's men might be watching, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. "There," Alex whispered, pointing toward a narrow gap in the rockfall that blocked the mine entrance. "We can squeeze through there." Samuel held up his lantern, casting dancing shadows on the broken stone. "Looks tight and unstable. One wrong move and we're buried." "It's our only chance. Pike will have the main entrance watched." They worked their way into the gap, lantern light revealing the twisted wreckage of wooden supports and fallen rock. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of disturbed earth. Alex's heart hammered as they squeezed between massive boulders, knowing that the slightest shift could crush them both. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into a larger chamber. Alex's modern LED flashlight, disguised as an unusual lantern, cut through the darkness to reveal the tunnel beyond. The walls were scarred and broken, but the passage itself remained clear. "My God," Samuel breathed, staring at the intact tunnel. "It goes back farther than I remembered." They moved deeper into the mine, following the old rail line toward the back wall where Alex had found the quartz vein. The air grew warmer as they walked, and a subtle hum seemed to emanate from the rock itself. "You feel that?" Samuel asked, his voice tight with nervousness. Alex nodded. The sensation was familiar now, the same electric charge they'd felt just before the collapse. They were getting close to whatever force had torn them from their own time. The tunnel ended at a wall of fallen rock, but Alex could see gaps between the larger stones where light seemed to flicker. Not the steady glow of their lanterns, something else, something that pulsed like a heartbeat. "There," Alex said, pointing toward the largest gap. "The vein is just beyond that rockfall." Samuel held his lantern higher, and both of them gasped at what they saw. Threads of gold ran through the exposed rock face like veins of liquid fire. The metal seemed to move in the lantern light, flowing and shifting as if it were still molten. But it was the quartz that truly defied explanation. The milky stone glowed with an inner radiance that had nothing to do with reflected light. "Sweet Jesus," Samuel whispered. "It's just like I remembered. But how is it possible?" Alex didn't answer. They were already moving toward the gap, drawn by the same compulsion that had led them to grasp the pickaxe handle. As they squeezed between the fallen stones, the air around them began to shimmer and distort. The chamber beyond was larger than the tunnel, a natural cave that the miners had expanded in their search for the vein. The walls were lined with the impossible quartz formation, threads of gold woven through the stone in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed alive, crackling with energy that made their skin tingle. "This isn't natural," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is something else." Alex approached the largest section of the vein, where the gold formed intricate spirals and knots that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The rock was warm to the touch, almost hot, and the sound they'd been hearing resolved into something like whispered voices speaking in a language that predated human speech. "Help me," Alex said, pulling tools from their pack. "We need to extract a sample." "Are you insane? Look at it. This isn't gold. This is something that shouldn't exist." But even as Samuel protested, his eyes were fixed on the glowing veins with the same hunger that had driven thousands of men to cross the continent in search of fortune. Alex began chipping away at the quartz, each blow of the hammer sending sparks of light dancing across the chamber walls. The first chunk of quartz came away easily, as if the stone wanted to be harvested. The gold within was heavier than it should have been, dense with possibilities that Alex didn't dare contemplate. They wrapped the sample in cloth and tucked it into their pack. "We should go," Samuel said, but he was already reaching for another section of the vein. "This is enough, more than enough." Alex was about to agree when they heard voices echoing down the tunnel behind them. Men's voices, rough and angry, getting closer. "Pike," Samuel breathed. They had been discovered. Alex's mind raced through their options. There was only one way out of the chamber, and Pike's men were coming up the tunnel. They were trapped. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the scrape of boots on stone and the rattle of equipment. Alex counted at least 3 different speakers, maybe more. Pike had brought enough men to handle any resistance they might encounter. "This way," Samuel hissed, grabbing Alex's arm and pulling them toward what looked like a solid wall. But as they got closer, Alex could see that it was an optical illusion. Shadows concealed another passage that led deeper into the mountain. They squeezed through the opening just as lantern light began to flicker in the main chamber behind them. Pike's voice carried clearly through the stone. "Well, well. Looks like someone's been mining our claim." The hidden passage was barely wide enough for one person, forcing them to move in single file through absolute darkness. Alex's flashlight revealed rough stone walls that closed in from all sides, and the air grew thin and stale. Behind them they could hear Pike's men examining the chamber, their voices echoing strangely in the confined space. "They came this way," someone said. Fresh tool marks in the stone. Find them, Pike's voice was cold as winter stone. They've seen too much to let walk away. The passage angled downward, following what might have been a natural fissure in the rock. Alex's sense of direction was completely scrambled. They might be heading deeper into the mountain or back toward the surface. All they could do was follow Samuel's lead and hope the passage didn't end in a dead drop. After what felt like hours of crawling through the narrow tunnel, they emerged into another chamber, this one completely natural. Strange formations hung from the ceiling like stone icicles, and the walls sparkled with deposits of various minerals, but it was the far wall that stopped them both cold. The quartz vein ran through this chamber too, but here it was different. The gold wasn't just threaded through the stone, it formed complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. And in the centre of the largest formation, something that looked almost like a doorway shimmered with the same distortion Alex had seen during the original collapse. "What is that?" Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. Alex approached the formation slowly, their scientific training warring with the instinctive fear of something that shouldn't exist. The air around the doorway was different, thicker, charged with possibilities. Through the shimmering distortion they could see glimpses of other places, other times, a flash of electric lights, the sound of automobile engines, the taste of processed air. "It's a way home," Alex breathed. Samuel grabbed their arm. "You're talking crazy. That's not a door. That's just rock and mineral deposits." But even as he spoke, they both heard footsteps approaching through the passage behind them. Pike's men had found the hidden entrance. Alex made a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. They pulled out their grandfather's Colt revolver and checked the cylinder. 6 shots. They would have to make them count. "Samuel," they said quietly, "I need you to trust me. When I tell you to run, you head for that shimmering patch on the wall and don't look back. That's solid stone." "No, it's not. And it might be the only way either of us gets out of here alive." The first of Pike's men appeared at the mouth of the passage, lantern held high to illuminate the chamber. Alex recognized him as one of the 3 who had confronted them in Samuel's store. His eyes widened when he spotted them, and his hand dropped to his gun. Alex fired first. The Colt bucked in their hand, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his lantern crashing to the cave floor in a spray of burning oil. "Pike!" the wounded man screamed. "They're armed!" More men poured through the opening, guns already drawn. Alex dove behind a formation of flowstone, pulling Samuel down beside them as bullets chipped stone from the cave walls. "You picked the wrong claim to jump," Pike's voice echoed through the chamber. "Now you're going to pay the price." Alex counted muzzle flashes. At least 4 men, probably more still coming through the passage. They had 5 shots left and no room for mistakes. "When I start shooting again," Alex whispered to Samuel, "you run for the wall. No matter what happens, you run." Samuel nodded, his face pale but determined. "What about you? I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But sometimes lies were all that stood between a good man and a senseless death. Alex rose from cover and began firing methodically, each shot aimed to wound rather than kill. The Colt spoke 4 more times, sending Pike's men diving for cover and buying precious seconds. "Go!" Alex shouted. Samuel ran for the shimmering wall, and Alex watched in amazement as the old miner didn't strike stone but seemed to pass through the distortion like it was made of water. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, leaving only ripples in the air to mark his passage. Pike appeared at the edge of the chamber, his face twisted with rage. "You killed my boys!" "They're wounded, not dead," Alex called back, but Pike was already raising his gun. The bullet caught Alex in the left shoulder, the impact spinning them around and sending the empty Colt flying from their hand. They stumbled toward the shimmering wall, vision blurring from pain and shock. Pike fired again, the bullet chipping stone inches from Alex's head. They could hear him reloading, hear his men regrouping for a final assault. With their last conscious thought, Alex dove toward the distortion in the wall. The world exploded into light and sensation. Colours beyond the visible spectrum painted impossible landscapes across their vision. Sounds from a dozen different time periods echoed in their ears. Automobile horns, telegraph keys, the distant roar of jet engines. The taste of ozone filled their mouth, and their skin crawled with electrical discharge. Then darkness claimed them, and they fell into unconsciousness with Pike's curses ringing in their ears. The first thing Alex became aware of was the taste of dust and blood in their mouth. The second was the steady drip of water somewhere nearby. The third was the pain in their shoulder, a deep ache that suggested the bullet wound was still there, but somehow different. They opened their eyes to familiar darkness, the darkness of the collapsed mine in the 21st century. Their LED headlamp had somehow survived the journey, casting its modern light on walls they recognised. The tunnel looked exactly as it had when they'd first entered, complete with rotted timbers and rusty rail tracks. Alex sat up carefully, exploring the wound in their shoulder. The bullet was gone, and the injury had partially healed, leaving only a puckered scar that looked weeks old. In their right hand they still clutched something, a chunk of quartz shot through with veins of impossible gold. The sound of voices drifted down from the tunnel entrance, modern voices speaking in contemporary English. Someone was calling their name. "Dr. Chen! Dr. Chen! Can you hear me?" Alex struggled to their feet, using the tunnel wall for support. The voices belonged to the search and rescue team they'd arranged to check on them if they didn't return by the scheduled time. How long had they been unconscious? How long had they been lost in 1849? "Here!" they called weakly. "I'm here!" Flashlight beams cut through the darkness as the rescue team made their way down the tunnel. 3 men in modern gear carrying medical equipment and climbing hardware. They looked shocked to find Alex alive and relatively uninjured in what should have been a completely unstable mine. "Jesus, Doc," the team leader said. "We've been looking for you for 3 days. The entrance collapsed right after you went in. We figured you were dead for sure." 3 days. Alex had lived weeks in the Gold Rush camp, had formed friendships and faced mortal danger, and only 3 days had passed in their own time. The rescue team helped them to the surface, where an ambulance waited to transport them to the hospital in Sacramento. As they loaded Alex onto a stretcher, one of the paramedics noticed the object clutched in their hand. "What's that?" Alex looked down at the chunk of quartz and gold, the only physical evidence of their impossible journey. Just a rock sample, nothing important. But even as they said it, they could hear something that made their blood run cold. Faint and distant, echoing up from the collapsed mineshaft, came the sound of pickaxes ringing against stone, the rhythmic percussion of men driven by dreams of gold, working in shifts that would never end. Samuel's voice seemed to whisper from the depths, the cursed mine, where miners vanished without a trace. Alex clutched the quartz sample tighter and let the paramedics carry them toward the modern world. But in their mind, they could still see the shimmering wall in the deep chamber, still hear Pike's men searching the tunnels for prey that had escaped through impossible means. The gold rush was over, but its ghost still haunted the Sierra Nevada. And somewhere in the tangled streams of time, a part of Alex would always remain in that lamplit world of desperate men and impossible dreams, listening to the eternal song of pickaxes in the dark. The hospital tests revealed nothing unusual, a mild concussion, some cuts and bruises, and an old bullet wound that the doctors couldn't explain. Alex told them it was a childhood injury, and after a few days of observation, they were released with instructions to take it easy and follow up with their regular physician. But Alex knew they would never be the same. The chunk of quartz sat on their desk at home, its gold veins catching and reflecting light in ways that physics couldn't explain. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, they thought they could hear voices calling from within the stone, the voices of men still searching for fortune in the endless tunnels of time. The official report classified the incident as a mining accident, with an unusually fortunate outcome. The Whitmore claim was sealed permanently, deemed too dangerous for further exploration. But Alex knew the truth. The mine wasn't just dangerous. It was a doorway, a crack in the fabric of time itself that had been torn open by human greed and desperation. And sometimes, late at night when the wind was right, they could swear they heard the sound of pickaxes echoing through the mountains, as if the gold rush had never ended, as if men were still down there in the dark digging for dreams that glittered just out of reach. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The desert sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Sophia Carter wiped sweat from her brow, her hands trembling slightly as she held the ancient pottery shards. Around her, fellow archaeology students chatted excitedly about their findings, their voices carrying the confidence she desperately wished she possessed. At 21, Sophia had dreamed of this moment, her first real excavation in Egypt, but 3 weeks into the dig, she remained invisible among her more accomplished peers. Another broken pot, Carter? Dr. Harrison, the expedition leader, barely glanced her way as he examined a limestone tablet discovered that morning. Perhaps you'd be more useful helping with the documentation. The dismissal stung, but Sophia forced a smile and nodded. She'd grown accustomed to being overlooked, always the student whose theories were met with patronising nods, whose discoveries were deemed insignificant. But today felt different. Today something called to her from beneath the sands. The sealed chamber had been uncovered just hours earlier, hidden beneath layers of sediment near the Giza complex. Unlike the well-documented tombs nearby, this one bore no cartouches, no identifying marks that would place it in the historical record. The entrance was smaller than expected, almost deliberately concealed, with strange hieroglyphs carved deep into the limestone threshold. Superstitious nonsense, Dr. Harrison had declared when one of the local workers refused to enter, muttering about curses and disturbed spirits. These warnings were common psychological deterrents, nothing more. But as evening approached and the team retreated to base camp for dinner, Sophia lingered. The forbidden chamber pulled at her like a magnet, promising the discovery that would finally prove her worth. She slipped back into the excavation site, her flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness. The descent into the tomb was treacherous, loose stones shifting beneath her feet as she navigated the narrow passage. The air grew thick and stale, carrying scents of ancient incense and something else, something that made her skin prickle with unease. Her light danced across walls covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of judgment and rebirth, of souls being weighed against feathers and found wanting. Deeper she went, following passages that seemed untouched by time, until she reached a chamber that took her breath away. Unlike the weathered hieroglyphs above, these markings appeared sharp, almost fresh, as if carved yesterday. They covered every surface in precise flowing script that seemed to pulse in her flashlight's beam. Sophia pulled out her notebook, hands shaking with excitement as she began to transcribe the unusual text. These weren't standard funerary inscriptions. They spoke of binding and release, of time as a river that could be redirected, of souls trapped between worlds. As she worked, she found herself unconsciously mouthing the words, her lips forming sounds in a language that felt strangely familiar. The first tremor was subtle, barely noticeable, but as she continued reading aloud, the ground beneath her feet began to shake more violently. The torches mounted on the walls, torches she hadn't noticed before, torches that definitely hadn't been lit when she entered, flickered and danced wildly. Sand began to pour from cracks in the ceiling, and a suffocating wave of grit and stone crashed down around her. Sophia screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of collapsing rock. Darkness claimed her as the ancient chamber sealed itself, and she plummeted into unconsciousness. The blazing sun struck her face like a physical blow, dragging her back to consciousness. Sophia groaned and sat up, spitting sand from her mouth and shaking grit from her hair. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The excavation site was gone. In its place stood a massive construction project that stretched as far as she could see. Workers swarmed like ants across the desert landscape, hauling enormous limestone blocks with primitive tools and pure human strength. The crack of whips filled the air alongside shouts in a language that was familiar yet archaic. And there, rising majestically against the azure sky, stood a pyramid. But not the weathered monument she knew. This one was alive with activity, its sides still under construction, its peak unfinished. Sophia struggled to her feet, her modern hiking boots slipping in the sand. Her backpack, miraculously still attached, felt impossibly heavy. Around her, the workers had begun to notice her presence, their labour slowing as they stared at her strange clothing and pale skin. "This isn't possible," she whispered. But even as she spoke, she knew with growing certainty that the impossible had occurred. The hieroglyphs, the chant, somehow she had been hurled backward through time. A group of workers approached, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the sunlight. They spoke rapidly in ancient Egyptian, a dialect so pure and unchanged that Sophia found she could understand fragments despite her limited linguistic training. They thought she was a foreign slave, or perhaps an intruder seeking to steal from the sacred construction. Before she could explain, even if explanation were possible, rough hands seized her arms. Her backpack was torn away, and when her digital camera tumbled out and accidentally triggered its flash, the workers recoiled in terror. The bright light seemed to confirm their worst fears. She carried the magic of the gods. They dragged her through the construction site, past endless lines of labourers hauling stone and mixing mortar. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. Thousands of workers coordinated in a massive undertaking that would take decades to complete. The air rang with the sounds of construction, hammers on chisels, the groaning of wooden levers, the chanting of work songs that helped coordinate the lifting of massive blocks. The high priest's tent was a marvel of ancient luxury, its interior hung with fine linen and decorated with golden artefacts. Kentimin, as he introduced himself, was a man of perhaps 50 years, his head shaved in the manner of his office, his eyes sharp with intelligence and suspicion. He questioned her through an interpreter, a young scribe who spoke several languages. Sophia's knowledge of Egyptology, meant to help her navigate the past, instead made her seem prophetic. When she mentioned details about pyramid construction that wouldn't be discovered for millennia, when she spoke of pharaohs and dynasties with casual familiarity, Kentimin's eyes widened with something between reverence and fear. "The gods have sent you," he declared finally. "You will serve in the sacred work under divine protection. But know this, foreign woman, the gods' favour is not unconditional. Serve well, and you will be blessed. Fail them, and your punishment will be eternal." And so Sophia found herself thrust into the brutal reality of ancient Egyptian life. She was assigned to the workers' quarters, a sprawling collection of mud brick buildings that housed the pyramid's vast labour force. The conditions were harsh beyond anything she had imagined. The food was scarce and tasteless, the heat was merciless, and the work was back-breaking. Her first friend was Nari, a girl of perhaps 16 who had been sold into slavery to pay her family's debts. Despite the hardships of her life, Nari possessed a bright spirit and quick intelligence that reminded Sophia painfully of her younger self. The girl taught her the rhythms of survival, when to speak and when to remain silent, how to conserve energy during the hottest hours, which overseers could be reasoned with and which were purely brutal. Kem was different, an older man whose weathered hands spoke of decades hauling stone. He had arrived as a child and knew no other life, but his eyes held dreams of freedom. In quiet moments, he would speak of the lands beyond Egypt's borders, of cities where no man owned another. His words carried the dangerous undertones of rebellion, and Sophia learned to listen carefully for approaching footsteps before he spoke. As weeks turned to months, Sophia began to experience disturbing dreams. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, appeared night after night, weighing her heart against a feather on golden scales. The dreams felt more real than her waking life, filled with whispers in languages she didn't recognize, and visions of chambers filled with writhing shadows. "You're bound to unfinished work," the god spoke directly into her mind. "The curse that brought you here demands completion. Until the sacred inscriptions are finished, you cannot leave this time." But the dreams revealed more than just her predicament. In vivid flashes, she saw the chamber's original purpose, not merely as a trap for grave robbers, but as a spiritual anchor designed to bind the pharaoh's soul to the physical world. The young pharaoh, barely 25, was dying of a mysterious wasting disease that had baffled the court physicians. Desperate to avoid the judgment of the afterlife, he had commissioned this heretical ritual. Sophia watched in her dreams as ancient priests debated the morality of their task. Some argued it was blasphemy, a violation of Ma'at, the fundamental order of the universe. Others insisted that preserving the God-King's life force was their highest duty. The compromise had been terrible in its elegance. The ritual would work, but it required a willing soul to take the pharaoh's place in death's embrace when the time came. The original victim had been a priest named Amenhotep, young and idealistic, who had volunteered believing he would be rewarded in the afterlife for his sacrifice. But the curse had bound him not to death, but to eternal waiting, trapped in a liminal space between worlds until someone else could complete the ritual and take his place. During her waking hours, Sophia found herself drawn to study the workers' daily routines with new intensity. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a machine of sorts, its internal chambers and passages designed to channel spiritual energy according to ancient principles she was only beginning to understand. Every angle had meaning, every measurement corresponded to celestial movements, every stone was placed with ritualistic precision. She began to notice patterns in the construction that hadn't been recorded in any modern textbook. The workers moved according to lunar cycles. Certain stones were only placed during specific hours, and the overseers consulted star charts before beginning each day's work. What modern archaeologists had interpreted as primitive superstition was actually sophisticated engineering based on principles that blended physics with metaphysics. Nari proved to be an invaluable ally in understanding these mysteries. Despite her youth and humble status, the girl possessed an intuitive grasp of the spiritual forces at work. She had been born with what the Egyptians called sight, the ability to perceive the invisible currents that flowed through sacred spaces. "The pyramid is alive," Nari explained one evening, as they shared their meagre ration of bread and beer. "I can feel it breathing, growing stronger each day, but there's something wrong with its heart, something incomplete." Through Nari's insights, Sophia began to comprehend the true scope of the ritual inscriptions. They weren't just decorative elements or religious texts. They were components in a vast spiritual mechanism designed to manipulate the fundamental forces of life and death. Each hieroglyph was precisely placed to create resonances and harmonics that would focus the pyramid's energy into the hidden chamber. But the system was flawed. The ancient priests, working in secret and under enormous pressure, had made subtle errors in their calculations. The ritual would indeed grant immortality, but at a terrible cost. The pharaoh would be trapped in an endless cycle of death and rebirth, experiencing the agony of dying over and over again throughout eternity. This realization brought Sophia face to face with a moral dilemma she hadn't anticipated. If she completed the ritual correctly, she might be able to return to her own time, but she would also be unleashing an abomination upon the world. The pharaoh would become something neither fully alive nor properly dead, a tormented being whose very existence would disrupt the natural order. Her nights became consumed with research, studying the hieroglyphs by moonlight when the overseers were asleep. She discovered that the ancient texts contained multiple layers of meaning, with hidden messages concealed within the obvious religious content. Some passages were warnings left by dissenting priests, cryptic clues about how to prevent the ritual's completion. Others were corrections to the original errors, instructions that could either perfect the immortality spell or destroy it entirely. The physical demands of her existence continued to take their toll. The desert sun bleached her skin and cracked her lips, while the constant labour left her hands raw and bleeding. The simple act of hauling water from the Nile became an exhausting ordeal, and she began to understand why so many workers simply collapsed and died from exhaustion. Yet she also witnessed moments of unexpected beauty and humanity. The workers had created their own culture within the harsh confines of their bondage, developing songs and stories that helped them endure their suffering. They shared food with those who were weaker, protected children from the worst abuses, and maintained dignity in the face of dehumanizing conditions. Kem proved to be more complex than she had initially assumed. His dreams of freedom weren't just personal fantasies. He was part of an underground network of slaves who passed information and sometimes helped individuals escape. His willingness to betray Sophia wasn't born of simple selfishness, but of desperate pragmatism. Too many escape attempts had ended in mass executions, and he couldn't risk the lives of others for the sake of one person, no matter how much he might personally respect her. "You don't understand what you're asking of us," he explained during one of their whispered conversations. "Every act of defiance costs blood. The overseers don't just punish the guilty, they punish entire work gangs, entire family groups. Your presence here threatens the delicate balance we've worked years to achieve." This revelation forced Sophia to confront the unintended consequences of her actions. Her modern sensibilities, her instinctive sympathy for the oppressed, were disrupting survival strategies that had taken generations to develop. What seemed like simple human kindness to her was perceived as dangerous recklessness by people who understood the true stakes involved. The political situation surrounding the pyramid's construction was more volatile than she had initially realized. The young pharaoh's illness had created a succession crisis, with various factions at court maneuvering for position. Some supported the immortality ritual as a way to maintain stability, while others saw it as an opportunity to install a new dynasty. The priests themselves were divided, with traditionalists opposing any deviation from established religious doctrine. Kenti Min, she learned, was walking a precarious tightrope. He genuinely believed in the pharaoh's divine nature and wanted to preserve his life, but he also understood that the ritual they were attempting violated every principle of Ma'at. His suspicion of Sophia stemmed not just from xenophobia, but from fear that her presence might be a sign that the gods disapproved of their actions. You arrive speaking of mysteries, carrying objects of power at the very moment when we attempt to change the natural order, he confided to her during one interrogation. Are you a gift from the gods, or are you their punishment? I cannot decide, and that uncertainty terrifies me more than any curse. As the pyramid neared completion, the pace of work intensified dramatically. The final chambers were being sealed, the internal passages were being blocked with massive granite plugs, and the capstone was being prepared for its ceremonial placement. Sophia realised that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Soon, the hidden chamber would be permanently sealed, and with it, any chance of returning to her own time. But her growing understanding of the ritual's true nature had complicated her desire to escape. She now knew that completing the inscriptions wouldn't just send her home, it would also unleash the flawed immortality spell upon the pharaoh, condemning him to eternal suffering. The ethical implications were staggering. Did she have the right to prioritise her own salvation over another being's torment? The answer came to her during one of her prophetic dreams. She stood once again in the Hall of Judgment, watching Anubis weigh hearts against the feather of truth. But this time, she wasn't a passive observer. The god turned to address her directly, his ancient eyes holding depths of wisdom that predated human civilization. You begin to understand, he said, his voice carrying the authority of cosmic law. The curse that binds you is not mere punishment, but opportunity. You have been given the chance to correct an ancient wrong, to restore balance to forces that should never have been disturbed. The choice is yours. Complete the ritual and return home, knowing you have unleashed suffering upon an innocent soul, or find another way to break the curse while preserving the natural order. But how? Sophia asked, her dream voice echoing in the vast hall. The inscriptions require completion. Without them, I'm trapped here forever. Anubis gestured toward the scales where two hearts now rested against the feather. One was dark and heavy with selfish desire, while the other glowed with the light of sacrifice and wisdom. There are always choices, the god replied. The curse seeks balance, not cruelty. If one soul is trapped, another can be freed, but only through an act of genuine selflessness. The young priest Amenhotep has waited 3,000 years for release. Give him what he was promised, and the curse will release its hold on you both. When Sophia awoke, she finally understood the full scope of what was required. The ritual chamber wasn't just a trap. It was a spiritual prison holding the soul of the priest who had originally volunteered for the immortality spell. If she could find a way to complete his interrupted journey to the afterlife, she might break the cycle that had ensnared them both. During her daily labour, Sophia began to notice familiar markings carved into some of the cornerstone blocks. They were fragments of the same hieroglyphic script she had read in the tomb, the script that had brought her here. Slowly she began to understand that the priests were working on something not recorded in any historical account, a ritual of immortality for the pharaoh, inscribed in the very stones of his eternal resting place. The hieroglyphs spoke of binding the soul to the physical world, of preventing the natural journey through the afterlife. It was heretical by Egyptian standards, a perversion of their most sacred beliefs. No wonder it had been hidden from history, sealed away where only the most determined could find it. But understanding her situation brought its own dangers. Kenti Min had grown increasingly suspicious of her knowledge, questioning how a foreign woman could know so much about sacred matters. Her compassion for the workers, sharing her food, tending to their injuries, teaching Nari to read, marked her as dangerous in the eyes of the authorities. She influences the slaves, she overheard one overseer telling another. They look to her instead of their proper masters. This cannot continue. The breaking point came when Sophia intervened to stop a brutal beating. A young boy had collapsed from heat exhaustion, and an overseer was preparing to make an example of him. Without thinking, Sophia stepped between them, her archaeological training lending authority to her voice as she explained the signs of heat stroke and the importance of water and shade. Her intervention revealed more than just medical knowledge. As she tended to the unconscious boy, her hands seemed to glow with a faint golden light that only Nari could see. The child's breathing steadied, his fever broke, and he opened his eyes with unusual clarity. Word of this miracle spread quickly through the workers' quarters, adding to the growing legend surrounding the strange foreign woman. The intervention saved the boy's life, but sealed her fate. That night Kem approached her with desperate eyes, but now she could see the full complexity of his situation. Through her enhanced understanding of the spiritual forces at work, she perceived the threads of fate that bound him, not just to slavery, but to a destiny that required her sacrifice. "They plan to make you disappear," he whispered urgently, "but I have made an arrangement. If you tell the priests that you've been planning to desecrate the sacred chamber, that you've been teaching the slaves to rebel, they will spare the rest of us. I can win my freedom by exposing you." But even as he spoke the words of betrayal, tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. Sophia realized that this conversation had played out before, in dreams and visions across multiple iterations of the temporal loop. Kem was as trapped by fate as she was, forced to repeat this moment again and again until the curse was finally broken. "I understand," she told him gently, placing a hand on his shoulder, "and I forgive you. We're all prisoners here, in different ways. Do what you must do." The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. The patterns were finally becoming clear, the cosmic machinery of justice was aligning itself for the final act. She could see now how every moment of her journey had been orchestrated, how every relationship had been designed to teach her the lessons she would need for the ultimate choice ahead. Within hours, she found herself dragged before Kentimin once again, but this time she faced the interrogation with new understanding. The High Priest's accusations were part of a script that had been written millennia ago, each word carrying weight beyond its surface meaning. When he spoke of desecration and corruption, he was unknowingly describing the spiritual damage that the immortality ritual would cause to the fabric of reality itself. "You will be sealed in the chamber you sought to violate," the High Priest declared, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy he didn't understand. "When the final stone is placed, your body will become part of the pyramid's foundation. Your soul will guard the pharaoh's treasure for eternity." As the guards led her away, Sophia caught sight of Nari in the crowd of workers. The girl's eyes held a deep sadness, but also a strange knowing, as if she too could perceive the threads of destiny that were drawing tight around them. In that moment, Sophia realized that Nari was far more than just a friend. She was the key to breaking the entire cursed cycle. The hidden chamber had been transformed since she last saw it. The walls now blazed with completed inscriptions, their hieroglyphic text seeming to writhe and shift in the flickering torchlight. The air itself felt thick with accumulated spiritual energy, crackling with potential that made her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. But now she could read the inscriptions with perfect clarity, understanding not just their literal meaning but their deeper purpose. The ritual was a masterpiece of spiritual engineering, designed to create a closed loop of energy that would sustain the pharaoh's life force indefinitely. But the loop required a constant source of power, a soul trapped in eternal suffering to feed the mechanism. The original priest, Amenhotep, had volunteered for this role believing it would be temporary. He had been promised that once the pharaoh's natural lifespan was extended, he would be released to continue his journey to the afterlife. But the priests had lied. The ritual required a permanent sacrifice, and Amenhotep had been trapped in the chamber for 3 millennia, his soul slowly being consumed to maintain the spell's power. As the final stones were being prepared, Sophia used her knowledge of the modern excavation to understand the chamber's true layout. But she also perceived its spiritual architecture, the invisible channels of energy that flowed through its walls, the focal points where different forces converged, the weak spots where the ritual's structure could be disrupted. Working frantically with a piece of broken pottery, she began carving new inscriptions into the soft limestone. But these weren't continuations of the immortality spell. They were counter-rituals, designed to release Amenhotep's trapped soul and redirect the accumulated energy into a different purpose entirely. Her fingers bled as she worked, her blood mixing with the limestone dust to create a paste that glowed with its own inner light. The inscriptions she carved weren't just text. They were spiritual circuit breakers, designed to safely discharge 3,000 years of accumulated mystical energy without destroying the pyramid or killing everyone inside it. As she worked, she began to sense another presence in the chamber. Gradually, the ghostly figure of a young priest materialized beside her, his form translucent, but his eyes blazing with desperate hope. "You can see me," Amenhotep whispered, his voice echoing from across the centuries. "You have the sight as I once did. Can you truly free me from this endless torment?" "I can," Sophia replied, not pausing in her frantic carving. "But the ritual requires balance. If I release you, someone else must take your place, not as a sacrifice, but as a willing guardian of the knowledge contained here. The Pharaoh's immortality spell must be prevented from ever being completed, and that requires a soul bound to this chamber throughout eternity." The ancient priest's face crumpled with anguish. "Then I am simply passing my curse to you. There is no justice in that, no redemption." "There is justice," Sophia assured him, "but not the simple kind we might prefer. The curse exists to prevent a greater evil. Your suffering has protected the world from the abomination that would have been created here. Now it's my turn to stand guard." As dust filled the chamber and the last block was positioned above the entrance, she began to recite the modified inscription aloud. The familiar tremor began beneath her feet, but this time it felt different, not destructive, but transformative, like the earth itself was sighing in relief. The chamber filled with golden light, more brilliant than before, and Anubis appeared not as a dream, but as a living presence. But he was not alone. Beside him stood another figure, a woman with the head of a lioness, wearing a golden solar disk. Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and destruction, the divine force who maintained cosmic balance through both mercy and judgment. "You have learned wisdom," Sekhmet spoke, her voice carrying the warmth of healing sunlight. "You understand that some burdens cannot be shared, only passed from one willing soul to another. But you have also discovered that even the greatest sacrifices can be transformed into gifts," she gestured, and Amenhotep's ghostly form began to glow with golden radiance. The priest's face filled with wonder as he felt the bonds that had held him for millennia finally dissolving. With a cry of joy that echoed through dimensions, he stepped toward the light and vanished, finally free to complete his interrupted journey to the afterlife. "You have learned the truth," he said, his voice echoing from stone and starlight. "The curse binds one soul to this place until another takes its position. To return to your time, you must leave something of equal value." Before Sophia could respond, she heard frantic scratching at the sealed entrance. Nari's voice called through the stone, desperate and afraid. Somehow, the girl had found the chamber and was trying to claw her way inside. "Please," Nari called, "take me with you. I know you have magic. I've seen the strange things in your pack. Don't leave me here." The golden portal swirled beside Sophia, showing glimpses of her own time, the excavation site, her team, the life she had left behind. But the god's words echoed in her mind, something of equal value. The curse would allow only one to pass through. Sophia looked at Nari, seeing herself at that age, young, desperate, dreaming of a better future. The girl deserved a chance at life beyond slavery, beyond the harsh realities of ancient Egypt. Without hesitation, Sophia pressed her hands against the stone and began to push. "Nari, listen to me carefully," she called through the barrier. "When the stone moves, you must step through the golden light. Don't be afraid. It will take you to a better place, a better time." "But what about you?" Nari's voice was thick with tears. Sophia smiled, though the girl couldn't see it. "I was always meant to stay here. This is my discovery, my responsibility. Make the most of the chance I'm giving you." With strength born of desperation and love, Sophia heaved the massive stone aside. Nari tumbled into the chamber just as the ceiling began to collapse. The girl's eyes widened as she saw the swirling portal, but Sophia pushed her toward it, watching as the light enveloped her friend and carried her to safety. The last thing Sophia saw was Nari's face, transformed with wonder and hope, disappearing into the golden glow. Then the chamber collapsed completely, crushing her beneath tons of ancient stone, but her heart was at peace. Centuries later, Dr. Harrison's team would discover her skeleton clutching a modern backpack, a mystery that would puzzle archaeologists for years. But they would also find her most precious gift, detailed papyrus scrolls written in her own hand, documenting pyramid construction techniques with unprecedented accuracy, revolutionizing their understanding of ancient Egyptian engineering. and in the modern desert outside the excavation site, a young Egyptian woman with strangely familiar eyes watched the dig with quiet satisfaction. Nari had lived centuries out of her own time, using Sophia's sacrifice to build a life of freedom and purpose, carrying the memory of her friend's love across the millennia. The curse was broken, but its lesson remained. Sometimes the greatest discoveries require the ultimate sacrifice, and the most precious treasures are the ones we give away. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The salt-heavy air of the Maine coast carried the familiar scent of seaweed and weathered wood as Evan Carter climbed the narrow spiral staircase of Winslow Point Lighthouse. At 16, he'd volunteered for community service hours, partly to pad his college applications, and partly because his parents thought fresh air might cure his tendency to spend entire days hunched over circuit boards in his bedroom. The Lighthouse Museum was exactly the kind of place that should have bored him senseless, but something about the mechanical precision of the building itself fascinated him. The gears, pulleys, and clockwork mechanisms that had once rotated the massive lens were like puzzles waiting to be solved. Today's task was cataloguing artefacts in the lamp room at the very top. Mrs. Henderson had left early for a dentist appointment, leaving Evan alone for the first time. The lamp room was a circular space enclosed by thick glass panels, and at its centre stood the lighthouse's crown jewel, a massive Fresnel lens, its prismatic surface catching and fracturing afternoon sunlight into rainbow fragments. The thing was enormous, at least 6 feet tall, constructed from hundreds of precisely cut glass pieces arranged in concentric circles. It was a masterpiece of 19th century engineering that made Evan's pulse quicken. Behind the great light sat the brass mechanism that controlled lens rotation, a complex arrangement of gears and counterweights. A weathered brass plaque warned, "Do not rotate, mechanism unstable." But from where Evan stood, the mechanism looked functional, waiting. Without quite deciding to do it, he stepped over the velvet rope. The primary control was a large brass wheel connected to the main gear assembly. Evan placed his hands on its worn surface and applied gentle pressure. The wheel moved smoothly and the massive lens shifted almost imperceptibly, catching sunlight at a different angle. Then he realised he couldn't stop. The wheel seemed to pull itself through his hands, gathering momentum as the lens continued to turn faster, its glass surfaces aligning in ways they hadn't been designed for. The afternoon sun found focus through the rotating lens with frightening efficiency. The air began to shimmer with heat distortion, and Evan could smell something burning. His ears began to pop as atmospheric pressure fluctuated wildly, and a low humming sound filled the space, organic and otherworldly. The lighthouse around him began to blur at the edges. The concentrated beam had become impossibly bright, and Evan felt profound disorientation as the floor seemed to tilt. With a sound like thunder contained in a small room, everything went white. The light, sound, and sensation compressed into overwhelming sensory input before everything went dark. When awareness returned gradually, Evan found himself lying on jagged granite that dug into his back. The lighthouse was still there, but everything else was wrong. The museum's parking lot had vanished, replaced by rough wooden buildings that looked assembled from driftwood. The lighthouse itself appeared functional but weathered, smoke rising from its keeper's quarters. Figures moved around the base with purposeful urgency, dressed in wool coats and wide-brimmed hats carrying muskets. The horizon was dotted with tall-masted sailing ships, with gun ports along their sides. A rough hand grabbed Evan's shoulder, one of the men, weathered and suspicious, studying Evan's jeans and sneakers with obvious confusion. "What year is this?" Evan asked, immediately regretting the words. 18 and 14, boy, and we're at war," the man replied, his grip tightening on his musket. "Now answer my question. Where did you come from?" "The War of 1812. Evan's mind raced through half-remembered history lessons about the conflict between America and Britain. Lighthouses would be strategically important for guiding friendly ships and denying navigation aids to the enemy. An officer approached, studying Evan's modern clothing with puzzled concern. When Evan reluctantly showed his cell phone, several soldiers gasped and reached for their weapons. The bright LCD display was probably the most advanced technology these men had ever seen. "I know about machinery," Evan said quickly, needing to make himself useful rather than threatening. "Mechanical systems, gears, clockwork. I could help maintain the lighthouse mechanism." This interested the lieutenant. After testing Evan's knowledge of lens systems and rotation mechanisms, they decided he could work under the supervision of Thorn, the elderly lighthouse keeper. Thorn was sceptical but willing to give Evan a chance, especially with British ships prowling the waters. For the next several hours, Thorn put Evan through intensive lighthouse maintenance training. They climbed to the lamp room where the massive Fresnel lens sat in its housing. Operating the rotation mechanism proved more challenging than Evan had expected. The clockwork system required constant attention, with counterweights needing regular winding and gears requiring lubrication. Feel is more important than knowledge, Thorn explained. You can understand how something works without being able to make it work properly. As evening approached, Thorn showed Evan how to light the whale oil lamp itself, emphasizing that the light never goes out. As if summoned by his words, weather began deteriorating rapidly. Wind rattled windows and rain intensified into driving downpour. "First test," Thorn said. "Storm's coming in hard and we need to keep the light burning until dawn." Throughout the night, Evan learned to feel the machinery's rhythm and personality. By dawn, when the storm broke, he felt like he'd completed a mechanical baptism. Over the following days, he settled into lighthouse keeping with desperate intensity. Knowing his survival depended on making himself indispensable, the work was physically exhausting, hauling fuel up spiral staircases, trimming wicks in darkness, maintaining mechanisms in salt spray. But the psychological strain was worse. Every aspect of daily life required conscious adaptation to a world without electricity, refrigeration, or any modern conveniences. Food was limited to preserved items, water had to be collected manually, and productivity was tied to sunlight availability. Most challenging was the constant awareness that he was living through actual history with real consequences. As weeks passed, rumours circulated about British intentions to assault coastal installations, with lighthouses being primary targets. "They're coming," Sergeant Morrison told Thorn during a security check. "Intelligence suggests coordinated attacks on multiple lights, trying to blind our ships all at once." Evan listened with growing unease, realising his presence was already altering historical events. His mechanical knowledge had improved the lighthouse's efficiency, potentially changing outcomes for ships that depended on navigation guidance. The moral implications kept him awake. By helping Americans maintain their lighthouse, was he changing the War of 1812 in unpredictable ways? But he couldn't abandon the people who had sheltered him. The dilemma intensified when Thorn mentioned something chilling. "Strange thing happened the night before you arrived. Found the rotation mechanism had moved on its own, turned the lens to an angle I'd never seen before, had to reset everything." He described seeing a flash of light and a man dressed in strange clothes, clearly describing Evan's arrival. That night, while maintaining the lighthouse beam, Evan studied the rotation mechanism with new understanding. The brass controls hummed with potential that went far beyond navigation. But experimenting with time travel while maintaining a critical wartime installation seemed irresponsible. Ships depended on the beam, and any interruption could cause maritime disasters. His contemplation was interrupted by urgent shouting from below. British ships were approaching under cover of darkness, their running lights extinguished. The attack everyone had anticipated was finally beginning. "British Marines," Thorn said grimly, climbing the stairs with surprising speed. 3 ships, maybe 4. They'll try to take the lighthouse first, then use it to guide their fleet through coastal approaches. Through the windows, Evan could see the vessels more clearly, fast shallow draft ships designed for coastal operations, each carrying 50 or 60 Marines. The lighthouse garrison of 20 soldiers faced overwhelming odds. "We keep the light burning," Thorn declared. "No matter what happens, the beam stays lit." Thorn revealed he suspected the truth about Evan and the lighthouse's capabilities. Legend says this lighthouse is cursed, that the lens can do things beyond normal understanding. Stories about ships disappearing in flashes of light. Before Evan could respond, cannon fire echoed across the water. The British had opened fire at the defensive positions while manoeuvring toward a concealed landing zone. "They'll land in the cove and come overland," Thorn predicted, pointing toward a hidden beach. "Marines will be here within the hour." Evan faced an impossible choice. He could continue normal lighthouse operations and hope the garrison held, or attempt to use the lens's temporal capabilities to change the situation, though he had no idea how to control the process or predict consequences. The sound of gunfire intensified as British Marines established their beachhead and advanced. Through the windows, Evan saw muzzle flashes and running figures as professional soldiers probed for weaknesses in the American perimeter. Hour, maybe 2 if they're lucky, Thorne assessed grimly. These aren't militia, they're regulars with combat experience. Another cannon shot struck the lighthouse, vibrating the entire structure and causing the lens segments to rattle. The mechanical disruption produced a subtle change in the beam's characteristics, reminding Evan of the anomalous effects during his original displacement. The beam, he asked Thorne, has it ever looked different? Changed colour or intensity? Once or twice, usually during storms when the mechanism gets stressed. Before Thorne could say more, the lighthouse door crashed open below, followed by boots on the spiral staircase. British Marines had breached the perimeter and were climbing toward the lamp room. Evan made his decision with desperate clarity. He began rotating the lens mechanism, not with steady control, but with the same experimental curiosity that had transported him to 1814. The brass wheel turned smoothly, gathering momentum as the massive lens shifted. "What are you doing?" Thorne demanded. "Something impossible," Evan replied, continuing to rotate the mechanism as ascending footsteps grew louder. The lens turned faster, driven by supernatural momentum that should have torn the brass gears apart. The beam began shifting and wavering, pulsing with irregular intensity as hundreds of glass segments aligned in unprecedented configurations. The air shimmered with heat distortion, and the familiar humming sound filled the space. The first British Marine appeared at the staircase top just as the lens reached critical threshold. He was a professional soldier moving with practiced efficiency, musket primed and bayonet fixed. But as he stepped into the lamp room, the temporal distortion field caught him. His body seemed to stretch and blur as he was pulled through space that didn't behave according to normal physics. His musket clattered to the floor as he vanished entirely. The effect spread downward through the lighthouse as more Marines encountered the expanding temporal field. One by one, they disappeared, displaced to unknown destinations as the tactical advantage of superior numbers became meaningless against forces operating outside normal space-time boundaries. "My God," Thorne whispered, "what have you done?" "I don't know," Evan admitted, though he suspected the Marines had been displaced rather than destroyed. The lens mechanism continued accelerating beyond his control, building toward an unknown climax. The lighthouse beam had become impossible light that bent and twisted air around it. Through the windows he could see effects extending beyond the lighthouse. The ocean's surface glowed with phosphorescent patterns, British ships backed away from incomprehensible phenomena, and stars seemed to shift in their courses. The British ships, caught in the expanding temporal field, began to fade like desert mirages, not sinking or burning, but becoming less substantial with each pulse. Within minutes, the entire assault force had been displaced, leaving only empty ocean and bewildered American soldiers who had been preparing to sell their lives. But the process wasn't stopping. The lens continued accelerating, the temporal field expanding, threatening to spread indefinitely and potentially affect the entire region or timeline. "The governor mechanism!" Thorne shouted over increasing noise. "The speed regulator!" Evan looked where Thorne pointed, a secondary control system designed to prevent overspeeding, but reaching it required crossing space now filled with temporal distortion, where air had become viscous and objects aged in accelerated cycles. Thorne began working toward the governor despite obvious danger, moving carefully through the hazardous field. Meanwhile, effects spread beyond the immediate area as the coastline itself began changing subtly, remembering different versions of its history. Evan realized the solution lay not in mechanical intervention, but in understanding temporal manipulation principles. The lens was responding to something deeper than gears. It interfaced with fundamental forces requiring intuitive understanding, rather than just technical knowledge. Closing his eyes, he reached out with senses he hadn't known he possessed, trying to feel the temporal current's shape and flow. The lighthouse wasn't just projecting light, but possibility, sending waves of potential change that could reshape reality according to conscious direction. The key was focus, not fighting the temporal field, but guiding it, giving it purpose rather than letting it expand chaotically. With new understanding came appreciation for the responsibility he carried. The power to manipulate time shouldn't be used carelessly, as every change could ripple through decades affecting thousands of lives unpredictably. But letting the field continue expanding risked destabilizing the entire region's timeline. Sometimes responsible choice meant acting decisively rather than hesitating indefinitely. Evan approached the mechanism with new purpose. Instead of stopping rotation mechanically, he focused his will on shaping the temporal field itself, visualizing distortion effects contracting and time resuming normal flow. The response was immediate. The beam began pulsing purposefully rather than chaotically. The temporal field started contracting, and mechanical systems resumed normal operation. "That's it," Thorn shouted, working with manual controls to stabilize the equipment. "Keep doing whatever you're doing." Together, they brought the lens rotation under control and reduced the temporal field to manageable levels. The lighthouse beam resumed normal characteristics, but the effects were irreversible. The British assault force had been displaced, the battle ended without conventional resolution, and the timeline had been altered in ways that would never be fully understood. As dawn broke over peaceful ocean, Evan and Thorn stood exhausted but alive in the lamp room. The mechanism had returned to normal operation, but Evan could sense potential for further temporal manipulation lurking below the surface. Over following days, word spread of the British fleet's mysterious disappearance. Intelligence reports suggested the entire regional naval strategy had been disrupted by the loss of their assault force. Ships and men had vanished without trace, leaving only confused accounts of impossible lights and inexplicable sounds. Evan realized his presence was creating paradoxes that threatened timeline stability. His knowledge, interventions, and temporal manipulations were introducing anachronisms with potentially far-reaching consequences. The solution lay in returning to his own time before paradoxes became irreversible, but using the lens again carried enormous risks for both himself and the timeline. The decision was complicated by his growing attachment to life in 1814. Thorn had become a father figure. The work gave him purpose he'd never experienced, and 19th century life's simple rhythms provided satisfactions modern existence never offered. But staying would mean accepting permanent exile from everyone and everything he'd known. The moral implications were staggering. Was he entitled to sacrifice an entire timeline for personal happiness? The choice was made when scouts reported new ships approaching. A British ship of the line with 74 guns coming to investigate and exact revenge. This time, the British were taking no chances with supernatural defences. "Ship that size can stand offshore and pound us to pieces," Morrison reported grimly. "Question isn't whether we can hold, it's whether we can make them pay enough." Evan could attempt another temporal manipulation, but using such power repeatedly carried escalating risks. Each intervention created timeline ripples that could cascade into major historical changes. "There might be another option," he told Thorn quietly. "The lens can transport people through time. I might be able to return to my own era, and if I do, the paradoxes I've created might resolve themselves." "How far forward?" Thorn asked calmly. "About 200 years. Thorn nodded as if temporal displacement across centuries was merely another technical challenge. "And you think going back will fix things?" "I hope so. Maybe time has a way of correcting itself, finding stable configurations despite temporary disruptions. Or maybe you're supposed to be here. Maybe this is where you belong." But the approaching warship required immediate solutions. In hours, heavy naval guns would reduce the lighthouse to rubble unless Evan acted decisively. "If I try to return," he explained, "I'll need someone to operate the lens mechanism while I position myself in the temporal field." "You mean someone stays behind?" "Yes. And if it works, you probably won't remember any of this. The timeline will adjust to eliminate the paradoxes." As the British ship moved into firing position, they climbed to the lamp room for what might be the last time. Evan positioned himself where temporal effects would be strongest, while Thorn took the rotation controls. "You know what to do?" Evan asked. "Turn the lens to match your previous angle, build rotation speed until the beam pulses, then maintain operation until displacement field reaches maximum intensity." The warship opened fire just as the temporal field began strengthening. Heavy cannonballs crashed into the lighthouse foundation, but the growing distortion seemed to provide protection, deflecting impacts that should have shattered stone and timber. Thorn maintained steady pressure on controls as the mechanism accelerated beyond normal limits. The beam transformed from simple illumination into theoretical physics phenomenon, with distortion waves creating interference patterns in the air itself. Evan felt familiar temporal displacement beginning, but this time experienced gradual transition rather than uncontrolled fall through time. He could observe the process, watching the timeline adjust around his displacement and events, reshaping to accommodate his absence. The British warship, caught in the expanding field, began fading like a mirage. Through shifting distortions, Evan glimpsed what his departure would mean. The lighthouse would continue normally under Thorne's guidance. The strategic situation would resolve conventionally, and history would resume its natural course without supernatural interventions. The final displacement moment came with thunderous sound and blinding light. Reality compressed into overwhelming intensity, then expanded into new configurations accommodating his return to the proper timeline. When consciousness returned, Evan found himself on the familiar wooden floor of the Lighthouse Museum's lamp room. Afternoon sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating carefully maintained displays of his own era. The massive Fresnel lens sat exactly as he remembered, surrounded by velvet ropes and warning plaques. But something was different. The brass surfaces showed subtle heat damage that hadn't been there before, slight discoloration where his hands had gripped controls, thermal stress from exposure to extreme temperatures. More disturbing was a small brass plaque near the lens base that definitely hadn't been there before. In memory of lighthouse keeper Josiah Thorne, lost at sea during the storm of August 1814. His dedication to maintaining the light saved countless lives and preserved this beacon for future generations. Evan stared in horror as implications became clear. His return had eliminated major paradoxes, but hadn't erased all consequences. Thorne's death was recorded as occurring during a storm, not a naval attack, suggesting the timeline had found ways to accommodate both his intervention and its own consistency. The old keeper died alone, maintaining the beacon, never knowing his sacrifice allowed a displaced time traveller to return home. Other subtle changes were visible throughout the museum. Several artefacts he remembered were replaced by items reflecting a slightly different lighthouse history. A new section dedicated to unexplained maritime phenomena featured accounts of ships vanishing during the War of 1812, including HMS Intrepid, which had disappeared in a flash of unusual light while approaching the main coast. Evan realised his temporal manipulations had created permanent historical alterations that couldn't be eliminated without risking greater paradoxes. The British ships he'd displaced were gone forever, but their absence was documented as maritime mysteries rather than supernatural interventions. The moral weight was overwhelming. He'd saved the lighthouse and its defenders but displaced hundreds of people to unknown fates. His actions preserved one timeline while potentially destroying countless others, a responsibility no 16-year-old should bear. But other changes suggested positive consequences. Displays about lighthouse technology referenced innovations in lens efficiency implemented at Winslow Point during the war, improvements subsequently adopted at other installations. His mechanical knowledge, filtered through Thorne's expertise, had contributed to advances in navigation safety that saved lives for generations. American shipping losses during the War of 1812 were recorded as significantly lower than previously estimated, particularly in Maine coastal waters. The improved lighthouse performance resulting from his presence had apparently provided navigation advantages, helping American vessels avoid both natural hazards and British naval forces. As evening fell, Evan found himself alone in the museum, just as when his adventure began. But the familiar routine of cataloguing artefacts felt surreal after his experiences with the operational lighthouse. Every gear and brass fitting reminded him of Thorne's patient instruction and professional competence. Most significant was his awareness of the lens mechanism's continued potential for temporal manipulation. The controls still hummed with residual energy, and he sensed possibilities for further displacement lurking below normal operation. The lighthouse remained what it had always been, a gateway through time. The temptation to experiment further was overwhelming. His successful return had proven controlled temporal displacement was possible, that the mechanism could achieve specific destinations across centuries. With practice, he might master the system completely. But the moral implications were staggering. Every intervention carried risks of unintended consequences, of creating paradoxes that could unravel entire timelines. His experience had taught him that even well-intentioned actions could produce results, extending far beyond their scope, affecting thousands of lives unpredictably. Moreover, he suspected the lens possessed some form of intelligence, that it selected operators based on criteria extending beyond mechanical competence. Perhaps his displacement hadn't been accidental, but part of some larger design he was only beginning to understand. As he prepared to leave the museum, Evan made a conscious decision to resist further temporal experimentation. The The lens would remain in its protective housing, surrounded by barriers he now understood were far more than liability precautions. The power to reshape time was too dangerous to wield casually. But he knew the knowledge and abilities gained during his time in 1814 would remain permanently. His understanding of mechanical systems, appreciation for past-present interconnectedness, and awareness of moral complexities in historical intervention would inform his choices for life. The lighthouse lens had given him more than temporal adventure. It had provided perspective on history and responsibility no classroom could convey. He'd learned the past wasn't fixed events, but living continuum that could be influenced by conscious action and moral choice. Taking one last look at the Fresnel lens, Evan saw it reflecting evening light in complex patterns, hinting at capabilities beyond navigation assistance. To casual observers, it was merely a historical artifact, but Evan knew better. It was a gateway through time, waiting for the next person with knowledge and courage to activate its potential. Walking away from Winslow Point Lighthouse, Evan carried memories of another time where his actions had made differences rippling through history for generations. The cycle would continue, each person adding their chapter to a story beginning with the first human who wondered about time's nature. But for now, Evan Carter was simply a 16-year-old volunteer walking home from his summer job, carrying memories of adventure and wisdom that would shape his life. Behind him, the lighthouse stood sentinel over darkening ocean, its lens waiting patiently for the next person brave enough to discover extraordinary possibilities hidden within its crystalline depths.